The day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket from Portland to Seattle. He hijacked the plane, claiming he had a bomb in his briefcase, and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He jumped out of the plane with the money and the bomb somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen again. The FBI claims to have investigated over 1,000 people, including dozens of deathbed confessions. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI suspended its investigation of the case. While the FBI is no longer looking for D.B. Cooper, there is a community of people who are trying to solve the case on their own. Welcome to the Cooper Vortex. In this episode, we're lucky to be joined by a lifelong resident of the Pacific Northwest, a former Air Force Staff Sergeant and graduate of Pacific University. This dude spends his days clerking in arraignments for the Oregon Judiciary and his nights as a Pacific Northwest historian. If he has any free time, he spends it debating people on the D.B. Cooper subreddit. That's where I found him. Enjoy this episode with my good friend, Jimmy Calhoun. All right, Jimmy, when did you first hear about D.B. Cooper?
Boy, so the first time that I specifically remember seeing D.B. Cooper, when I was pretty young, like maybe 9 or 10, my grandma gave me a coffee table book from the early 80s. I believe it was published in 1981, anywhere from 79 to 81. And it was a Reader's Digest compilation book called Mysteries of the Unexplained. And it had all kinds of like little mysteries and occult things, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, but written about and cited in a scholarly kind of format. It was a Reader's Digest thing. And there was a little section on D.B. Cooper in the back. And being that I grew up in Washington State, and just kind of the allure of the mysterious, they had the composite in there that it's the Bing Crosby sketch. It's kind of colloquially known as, and the one with the sunglasses on, and it was just very intriguing. So I think I was probably 7 or 8 at that time. So this would have been in the late 90s.
And how old are you right now?
31.
So you'd be one of the young guys in this group here.
Yep, one of the younger ones, no doubt about it.
And, I'm from Washington State also. And so it's just, as someone who's a fan of mystery and stuff like that, Cooper is just sort of a local legend, a myth kind of a thing. When did it go past that for you into something that you were seriously reading about and researching?
Oh, pretty quickly, for sure. So when I was younger, you're kind of limited by the resources you have at your disposal. And in the late 90s, the internet wasn't something that everybody had. We didn't have internet where I grew up for many, many years. We didn't even have a computer really until I was in my mid-teens. So I would say probably over the next few years. So by the time I was 12, I was reading kind of the usual literature, which at that point was the Himmelsbach, the Himmelsbach book, which is called Nordjak, I believe. It's a book that he wrote, for those who are unaware, although people listening to this are probably aware. It's the book that Ralph Himmelsbach wrote with somebody else. I can't remember who co-authored it, but so I read that book, and then of course I read Richard Tusaw's book, which is D.B. Cooper, Dead or Alive, and then I even read, there was a novel. It was just called D.B., and it was a fictional novel, and it was published by a major publishing company. I didn't end up reading all of that at that time, but so that, and then the last one that I specifically remember reading was D.B. Cooper, What Really Happened, by, I think, Max Gunther.
Yes, Max Gunther.
That book kind of resurfaced a few years ago. But so that was at age 12 or 13 is when I started reading stuff like that and really dug in as far as I could at that age, right? Didn't really have the internet. So it was kind of like read everything you can and then try to hope some information pops on the local news.
Max Gunther at 12 years old. That's interesting. And I'm kind of jealous at the same time.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know how much of it I actually retained. Like I was probably no more capable of a reader than anybody else at that age, especially. But I just kind of was a weird kid, so I really was interested in mysteries and stuff. And my grandma was really into like the occult and, the Loch Ness Monster and the Bermuda Triangle. And these are all things I fixated on. So I don't know if it was because I was particularly intelligent. I just was kind of odd. And so I've reread these books, all of them, and I don't think I retained very much. But yeah, so that's when it really kicked off.
At 12, that's pretty impressive. So from there, I assume you got onto the drop zone.
Yeah, yeah, I sure did. Of course, yep. That was a little later, but yeah, yep.
And then when did you start posting and interacting with other people in the Cooper Vortex? I became aware of you on Reddit.
Yeah, I was a really late bloomer with that. I never posted on the internet forums because there's been a few of them. There used to be one called Sluggo. In Sluggo, I don't remember the gentleman's name who ran that, but he was kind of one of those early
I'd
guys.
rather refer to him as Sluggo. I'm not sure if he wants his name out there.
Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect. I don't remember it.
But his website, I believe it was N467 US.
Oh, okay. Very well. Well, so there was that, and there wasn't really a chat feature on there. But yeah, so I didn't really post anything until maybe the last couple years, as some of the suspects started to be brought up again, and I kind of really got into the case again, because it comes and goes. And so this was at a point where I was like really into it again. I did make a couple posts, but there was a good 15 years there, or yeah, maybe 10 to 15 years where I never post anything. I was just kind of a fly on the wall that would read other people's posts.
Was there anything that sparked the interest back in it in particular, or just sort of timing and circumstances?
Well, so like I always look up DB Cooper stuff, like as far as, every 3 or 4 months when I'm not really diving into it all the time. So every 3 or 4 months, I'll be like, I wonder if anything's going on in DB Cooper world. I wonder if there's any new information or a new suspect. And so I've done that off and on forever. And this latest one, I just got done with school. And so I had a big chunk of my free time that came available. And my girlfriend lives in Vancouver. So kind of being in Vancouver, I think I had a conversation with somebody. Oh yeah, we're in DB Cooper territory. And then that kind of, it's like, hey, I have some free time now. I'm really going to start to look at this stuff again. And so the latest one has been because of that. But, it's triggered by different stuff all the time. Over the years, something will come up, or I'll see something on the news or something. But it's always right there.
All right, well, let's get into it. I want to start with something I said we would get back to in the last episode, and I was criticized for not getting back to it. So we'll start right there.
Cool.
What is your take on the Max Gunther book, Jimmy? Is it real? Is it a hoax?
Oh boy. When I was younger, because I've read it a few times over the years, and I actually have a copy of it sitting in my car right now. So, when I was younger, I really wanted to believe that it was true. And I think that kind of, a lot of this stuff starts with like a want to believe. Like if you want to believe, DB Cooper survived, or if you want to believe that he didn't survive, and maybe it's something that's kind of in your subconscious that you're not super aware of, then, you'll kind of find a theory that tends to fit that, I think. But as far as the Max Gunther book goes, I don't believe it. And I don't believe it, not because I think Max Gunther was a liar, or not because I think, he was not a good writer. He was a fantastic journalist. I don't know his full history really, but I know that he won different awards for his writing. And I know that he was a very esteemed journalist for quite some time. So it's not really that. It's just that I just don't trust that people are the most ethical. And so there's no verification in the Max Gunther story. There's no tangible evidence. There's nothing that can really verify this story. We just have this lady who said she knew who DB Cooper was, basically, that she had, and it's also a little too romantic and a little too perfect for me to really believe it without any, again, no documentation, no citations, no nothing like that. And so to me, it's an awesome story. I love that book, but I just don't, without any proof, I don't believe it, because there's been too many people with similar stories, kind of.
But the problem with the Max Gunther book is, who is pulling off this con? Is it Max Gunther? Is it Clara? Is it both?
Yeah. No, it is fascinating. I have thought of that too. Especially with, I don't believe that Gunther had any other types of books like this, or any type of writing like this, other than the DB Cooper book. So I tend to believe that somebody was it probably wasn't him, but as happened earlier in the DB Cooper universe, in the early 70s after the hijacking, and this is available in the FBI 302s. This is something that kind of got lost to time for many, many years. Somebody else pulled a kind of a con job like this, although with Clara and Max Gunther, it's kind of strange, because it's like, well, what would her motivation be to carry something like this forward? She wasn't being compensated, that we know of, financially. So why would she do it? But again, I don't know if people need a reason necessarily.
That's true. It's just, like you said, she wasn't financially compensated according to what we know. There is the weird details, like you could verify those birthday messages that sort of originated the contact, which, if you're not aware of what we're talking about, we're like super deep into the weeds on the Max Gunther story here. So, but it's interesting to me because Max Gunther presents it as nonfiction, but finishes the book saying he's not sure whether this is true or not, but he does believe that it's true. And
right.
To stake your reputation as a journalist, publishing a fake story, especially in, I think, the books like 1985, is a lot bigger deal than now, where any news story could be fake, right, or be completely made up, and there's no punishment or anything like that nowadays. But I think in 1985, if he would have done that, it would have been a much bigger deal, and I think it would have been the end of his career.
For sure, yeah. And the part with the disclaimer, I'm not sure what the legal boundaries are, like if his publisher was like, you should put a disclaimer in there somewhere, or if he did it on his own volition. I'm not sure, of course, but I mean, he could have believed it, and that's, if he believed it, and then to him it was nonfiction, and I think that case could be made for a lot of people. I'm sure we'll get into other suspects and stuff, but I think a lot of times people that publish these stories, that write these books, I think some of them don't dig that deep, and so that they don't have to think if it's true or not. They just kind of go with it. But I think in Max Gunther's case, and in many other cases, they genuinely believe that something is true, and so that kind of takes them off the hook a little bit, at least psychologically anyway.
That's very true and very well said, and applies to most people in the Cooper vortex, I think.
Yeah, it definitely does.
So let's finish off this Max Gunther thing. Do you think that there is any way that book could lead us to who DB Cooper is?
No, not really. Well, so I know that there's some folks who, and I don't want to mention them specifically. I don't know if they would want that or not, but I do know that there's some people that have done extensive research on it. And I'm aware of the suspect that's linked to it. And,
William J. Smith.
Right. William J. Smith, a railroad worker. He's from the eastern United States, Pennsylvania, I believe. And he does look a lot like the sketch. He's almost too perfect, but so I don't want to ever say like, no way, like never, ever. It's possible. I mean, a lot of that book, when matched up with what we kind of think we know now, a lot of it does sound pretty plausible. the fact that his last name was Leclerc, and how there might be a French connection, not to reference the classic movie with Gene Hackman, but there might be some kind of French connection. And so there's some other stuff too. I think that in the book, and I don't remember exactly what his job was in the book, but I believe he was some kind of engineer. And so there's these parallels.
Industrial chemicals.
I mean, if you're looking for DB Cooper, that, with what we know now based on the analysis of Tom Kay, and the independent research lab that also analyzed the tie, it doesn't get much better than that. So, those are pretty big coincidences. So those things, but everything in DB Cooper is kind of like that, it's like, well, as soon as you think, for sure, like, no, there's no way this is the guy. Then something's like, well, maybe. But, I think that probably coincidental, pretty amazing coincidences, really pretty ironic, but I would be shocked if it led to the true identity of DB Cooper. I would be pretty surprised.
I think I would be surprised as well, although I would love it if that book turned out to be totally true.
Oh, me too. Me too. Yeah, I would love that. Max Gunther was a good author too. He was a good writer. And he, narratively, the book holds up great. It's well paced. He definitely knew what he was doing on the technical writing side. It's not too long, it goes along at a pretty good clip. So there's that. But also, I mean, who doesn't want to believe that he had a romantic rendezvous and he survived and all these things? Like, of course, I want to believe that.
Yeah, the romantic rendezvous is makes for a great story.
It does make for a great story. And, there's a lot of value in that, even if it, probably, in my opinion anyway, will never end up being really tied to the DB Cooper thing. I like the fiction books that are based on DB Cooper as well. There was one novel that I talked about. It's just called DB. I don't remember who wrote it, but it was good too. People are at least some people are very adept at weaving a narrative around, things like this, mysteries. It's kind of this historical fiction angle. But anyway, so even if it's a complete work of fiction, I do love that book.
What are your favorite books on DB Cooper? And it could be the same question, but what books do you recommend others start with?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so this is kind of crazy. And I didn't really find this out until recently. So my favorite book on DB Cooper is the Richard Tusaw book, DB Cooper, Dead or Alive. It's kind of a classic, in the DB Cooper lore. It's a book that has been talked about a lot. Richard Tusaw was an interesting guy. And I love that book because there's a lot of stuff in that book that is really interesting, that it doesn't get repeated a lot when the story, and he talked, I believe he worked directly with Tina Mucklow, did interviews with Tina. And so there's some interesting nuggets in there that I could completely forgotten about because I hadn't read the book in a long time. And so when I picked the book up again a few weeks ago and I read it, there was some stuff in there. Well, it's probably been a few months now, but there was some stuff in there where I was like, holy cow, I didn't even really realize this, or I had completely forgotten these important little pieces of information. And so I definitely recommend that. It's kind of difficult to come by. Most bookstores aren't going to have it. I believe it's been out of print forever. He only printed 50 or 60,000 copies, I think. So it's kind of harder to find, but if you can find it and get a good deal on it, that's a great one. The book Skyjack, I think, by Jeffrey Gray is a good one. I'm not so partial to the personal narrative. That kind of, I'm more of, at least with this type of stuff, I'm more like, just give me the facts. I want to know facts. I want citations. I want to see all the evidence. So the personal parts of it are not, my favorite thing in the world. But
right. Skyjack is an adventure that you follow along with.
Right. And even though it's not, my number one favorite thing, the fact that it's not just the facts, it's still a great book. And Jeffrey Gray, I think, as a researcher, really remained impartial for the most part and did his best. And it comes across well. So that's a good one. But and then the Ralph Himmelsbach book, which was one of my favorites when I was younger, and I had no idea, but it's almost impossible to get a copy of that book now. I owned one for a long time, and I think I just lost it over the years. It's like $300 or $400 online.
That makes me so upset. If I could, today is actually the 4th anniversary of the Cooper Vortex, but if I could go back in time to when I started the show, the only piece of advice I would give myself would be to buy as many copies of these books as I can. Because 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I started buying these books, I want to say I got Tusaw's book for like $7 on Amazon.
Yep.
I got Himmelsbach's book used for like $13, and it was a signed copy when I got it.
Man,
which
I think
awesome. I think most of them are.
I think so too. Yeah, I only ever had a discarded library copy, and if I remember right, I think it was signed. Yeah, no, and that the Himmelsbach book, I would probably put that even above the Jeffrey Gray one, not for any other reason other than Himmelsbach is kind of one of these key players in the D.B. Cooper universe or vortex, so to speak. And it's really interesting to kind of try to get his full viewpoint because it changes over the years, right? When you hear him in 1978, when he's doing In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, or 1979, maybe, he sounds a little bit more open-minded as to the possibilities of who this guy could be. Then fast forward to the mid 2000s when he's on different broadcasts like the National Geographic one, suddenly, he used filthy language, he says. So he kind of goes against himself a little bit. But part of that could be that when you do broadcasts or when you do programs for, major networks like that, they kind of tend to splice things and make cuts here and make cuts there, and present some information out of context, if for no other reason other than, they have 40 minutes to do this show. And so, I'm not sure if that's how Himmelsbach really felt in the 2000s and if it really changed that much from the 1970s, but his book is a really fascinating insight into how he really thought. And I haven't read that one in quite a while. It's really hard to get a copy of it.
What about the more modern books? Dr. Edwards' book, Bruce Smith, Drew Beeson, Paratrooper of Fortune.
So the Suspect books, Bruce Smith's book I have read. I know that it would probably draw a considerable amount of ire from him that I haven't even mentioned his book yet, and it's not deliberate. So Bruce Smith's book, I like. I understand, like, Bruce Smith is a great writer. He's a great wordsmith. He's a great orator. He speaks really well. He speaks in front of people excellently. And I really enjoy listening to Bruce, and I enjoyed the book, but it's not my favorite reference material, just because I think there are some elements in there that, the stuff where the FBI is kind of complicit, or, maybe they are also, know more than they're saying. I don't really believe that. And so those aspects of Bruce Smith's book, which is D.B. Cooper and the FBI, I believe, it's a great book. I do recommend it. But for me, in the types of material that I have the most faith in, again, I like the facts, personal anecdotes, or persuasive writing as it relates to mysteries and things like that. It's not my favorite. So I have read it. It's a great book. Paratrooper of Fortune, I haven't read. I'm familiar with Drew Beeson and Ted Braden, of course. Haven't read it, so I can't really speak on it. And the other ones I haven't read either, like the one about Walt Reka. Haven't read it. Probably won't read that one. Drew Beeson's book I might at some point, just because I think his heart's in the right place. But I haven't read those ones yet, but I'm open to it.
What about Martin Andrade's Finding D.B. Cooper, Chasing the Last Lead?
Oh, I have not read that one, actually.
You haven't read that?
I haven't read it.
I'm ashamed of you.
Yeah. Well, so I've read a lot of stuff that he's posted. I think he either posted on the Mountain News a lot, or he had his own website that he hosted DB Cooper information on. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, he did have his own blog. I think it's still up, but I don't believe he posts very much on there.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I always thought he was like the way that he presented the information, he tried to remain as objective as possible. And for me, that's a big thing, right? Objectivity. If, it's impossible to ever be truly objective because your writing is informed by your personal opinions. And there's certain ways you can word things to where, we can still parse through the information and see probably what you believe or how you feel.
Oh,
And
certainly.
and Bruce, he's very talented at remaining as subjective as possible. And so I don't want people thinking like, well, he says the FBI is in on it in his book. You could maybe infer that, but Andrade, is that how you pronounce his last name? Andrade. He's a great writer too, very objective. I saw that I think he was supportive of a suspect now, which is interesting. But for a long time, I'm not sure what his position on that was. And I just read his blog posts and stuff. And I would love to read that book. There's so many of them out there now. It's hard to keep them all straight.
Definitely. I have a lot of respect for Marty. I think he's a super sharp guy. And his book, if I come across someone who's like, I'm not sure if he survived the jump, or I definitely think he died in the jump, right away, I'm like, you got to take a look at Marty's book, because he does such a great analysis of the survivability of that jump. And when I read his book, I was like, from there, 100% he survived the jump. Totally.
I'll have to look into that. I know I have the book in my mind's eye. I know exactly what it looks like. It's greenish. It has the map on the front. I'm colorblind, so maybe it's maybe it's blue, but it has the map of Southwestern Washington superimposed on the front. So I definitely know the book, but I can't definitively state whether or not I read it. So I'm just going to say I haven't, but not out of any disrespect for Mr. Andrade. I think he's a wonderful writer, and I'll have to add it to the list, the ever-growing list of D.B. Cooper books. I read the one by I'm drawing a blank on his name, but it's the one Last Master Outlaw. I did read that one.
Thomas Colbert.
Thomas Colbert, that's right. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I read another D.B. Cooper book a number of years ago. D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy. I always forget about that one. So that's another one.
Boy, I wish I would have bought a thick stack of those books too. I think I
paid they valuable?
Like $8 for mine. Oh yeah.
Oh man, I think I might still have a copy of that laying around. I'll have to check through my stuff. If I have one, we'll be in further contact. I'll pop it in the mail or something, but if you haven't read it. But anyway, so I did read that one, and Last Master Outlaw. So those are just two more that just came to my mind or whatever.
I think it's interesting that you like the Tucson Himmelsbach book, because I find myself, I won't recommend those books to new people because they're pre-internet. And so I think if you're coming into this case and you don't know absolutely everything, or you want to know exactly what Himmelsbach said, I want to recommend a book that was written after the creation of the internet.
We might differ here a little bit, because for me, I want the books that are as close to the actual event as possible, because over time, things get left out, little bits of information get omitted. So for me, I might recommend D.B. Cooper Dead or Alive, because it's not a daunting thing, like it's a pretty slim book.
It is a short book. And like you said, it has a lot of facts. It has, interestingly, a list of the serial numbers of the money.
Yeah, that is a lot of the book too. It's like the whole last 20 pages.
And there are interview details and hijacking details that I think were released to the public for the first time in that book.
Yeah.
So I do think that's interesting, but I would reserve those books for the hardcore crowd.
Could be too. Yeah. It's interesting, like for people that, for the uninitiated or whatever, it's tough, like I think people, I know that there's books that people will enjoy or that might get people interested in it. Another, angle to it is like, I try to, especially when I talk to folks about DB Cooper, of course, I throw in my own opinions. But if there's ever anybody that's like, oh, I'm new here, I don't know much about this, can you explain it to me? I always try to be objective. So that, of course, that's going to factor into it too. Like if you recommend somebody, a book that is based on a suspect, and it's trying to persuade the reader that it's this suspect, then that might kind of color the reader's viewpoint a little bit. So they might go into the DB Cooper case. And I think there's a lot of people out there like that will read a book like Last Master Outlaw or a different book or any book that is claiming that a suspect is DB Cooper, and then that'll kind of be their first suspect, and then maybe they'll move off of it, maybe they won't or whatever. But so I probably wouldn't recommend a book like that, but I think too the Jeffrey Gray book would be a good place to start because it's written really well, and there is that personal narrative part of it too.
I think the Jeffrey Gray book is a great place to start.
Yeah, that might be really the place to start, because he does, even though Tusaw's book, which was published in 87 or 88, even though it does have a lot of those interviews and like things that you don't really see elsewhere a lot, I think Skyjack uses that as a reference material. So I think a lot of that is talked about in Skyjack as well. So you could probably get that same information in that book.
You make a great point, Jimmy, about people coming into the case through a suspect book, because the first book I read was Skyjack, which sort of leads you towards Kenny Christensen.
Yeah.
And then, when I read that book, it had been out, it'd probably been out for 3 or 4 years by the time I read it. And in it, he's like, yeah, this guy I was working with, he's not working with me anymore because he says he's going to write his own book. And so when I finished Skyjack, I was like, okay, I got to find that book, get on Amazon, Into the Blast. And I read that book and boom, it's Kenny Christensen. I'm positive Kenny Christensen is DB Cooper. And then I got on the Drop Zone and I was like, I saw I think it was Georgia and Bruce Smith had just torn it apart. And I was like, well, if it's not Kenny Christensen, then what the heck is going on? And I got further into it from there. But I think a lot of people, to your point, will read that one book and, oh yeah, it was Walter Recca. Oh yeah, it was McCoy. Oh yeah, it was Kenny Christensen or Ted Braden. And their personal investigation into DB Cooper stops there because they're comfortable knowing that's who it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then people kind of fall into that confirmation bias a little bit where they're only going to seek out information that confirms what they already believe to be true, right? They already think they know who it is. So they're not going to read people that are presenting information or their own opinions that differ from that. They're going to tend to look for things that may reiterate what they already believe. And so, I mean, and then too, like a lot of people, like honestly, probably don't find their way into the case by picking up a book. Definitely today, way more common is that people, on the Drop Zone back in those days, people that was, the Drop Zone became popular right kind of as National Geographic did the Decoded episode where they talk about Kenny Christensen. I mean, it had been around for a while, but it exploded in population after that National Geographic, or I don't remember if it was that, maybe a bit Discovery, that is the episode on Kenny Christensen. And so a lot of people find their way into the case through the Netflix documentary or, various different documentaries that have been done over the years. And so in those, they usually, present kind of the more romantic or more interesting angles to the story. So they usually kind of have a suspect they move toward. And so people that, watch those documentaries and then come into the case are like, what's the mystery? I think it's so-and-so, right? And it's because they watched the documentary. And so that kind of, again, colors their viewpoint on who DB Cooper is. But yeah.
Yeah, and not to bash anyone, but those are the worst people to deal with. I mean, the recent Rackstraw piece on the Netflix thing, and then Dan Greider's YouTube video about McCoy.
Yeah.
Both of those, it was just like all of a sudden I got unsolicited emails like, why do you keep doing the show when it was obviously McCoy or it was obviously
Oh yeah.
Rackstraw?
Yeah.
And it's like those two suspects in particular, I just feel like you don't know the case
I
if
have a
you're
theory on
pitching
that.
one of those two. Let's hear it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think it's probably the people that are pushing each suspect and responsible for the content that are sending you emails. I'm teasing, but DB Cooper world is kind of strange. The vortex. People feel very passionate about that. So like you said, I don't want to disparage anybody or talk anybody's content down. I can do that in private, but this is a public forum, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if you were getting emails from people that were in real thick with each of those respective suspects. But yeah, man, people watch those and they stick to that, right? Like they come for you. They're like, it's definitely Richard McCoy. And like, I don't understand, like, or they just use the same tone, like in every post of like, I think it's this person. And it's like, how many accounts do you have? You have the same mistakes in your writing, like for all these different people that you say you are, all these different accounts. Funny, all of them put two spaces after the last letter, then the period, then no space and start the next sentence or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah, that definitely happens in the Cooper world. It's very it's very weird. There's a
it
lot
is
of like
people.
fake online personas.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's rampant, and the other thing about it too, I don't, the psychology of the Cooper Vortex, mainstays like the cast of characters in a way is almost more fascinating or equally fascinating. Not to me really, but it is very fascinating, like the types of people that are attracted to the DB Cooper mystery specifically. It's generally people that aren't into other true crimes. They just somehow end up collecting around the DB Cooper case, and it draws in a pretty interesting cast of characters.
I am very interested in that as well. I mean, you listen to the opening of the show,
Yeah.
and the show is about the people trying to solve this case.
Yeah. Yep.
And
It's
it's a completely self-selecting group. No one is here because they're forced to continue their research on the DB Cooper case. Well, actually, that's not true. I guess you could make an argument for people like Joe Weber or
mm,
Rekka's niece or the Foremans who were sort of sucked into the vortex through someone else.
yeah, it's really interesting. I just made this point the other day. Somebody was talking about a newer suspect that they were developing. And one of the things that is true in every case with every suspect that has ever been presented and, in an open forum or on an open platform, or every suspect that's ever gained any media traction, everyone has a whole list of family members and friends that think that it could be them. And so I've always thought, like, as soon as somebody's like, I don't think my relative did it, that's the suspect I'm going to go to, right? Because it's like, oh, hey, here's an outlier. Every other suspect, their whole family is like, yeah, I think they could have been him. It's like, I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thing, right? It's like, what is the psychology where, your dead loved one having been DB Cooper is an interesting, it's that would be a plausible for you, like that's every member of my family that's dead. I could take one look at them and be like, no, that's not them. but but I think it's an attractive proposition. But that gets into the psychology, I think, of who people believe DB Cooper was versus who he in all actuality probably was.
Yeah, I think we could talk about that for hours because you get into confessions and also DB Cooper is cool. You're not saying, oh,
Absolutely.
you know what? I think my grandpa could have been the Zodiac killer. Isn't that neat? Nobody
Right.
says that.
Nope, there's not a whole lot of people. I mean, there are some people that do claim things like that, but it pales in comparison to the DB Cooper thing. I mean, there's been just parsing through the FBI documents, the 302s, I mean, how many people said that their friend or their lover or their spouse or their ex-spouse, I mean, it was hundreds, if not thousands of people that said that they know who it is, that they think it's this person. And a lot of the times it was people that were like still friends. They weren't estranged from their family member. So it's like, these people are like calling the FBI on their brother, thinking that they're an airplane hijacker. But the deceased spouse angle or deceased loved one angle is probably a whole different psychology altogether. It might give their lives more meaning in some way. If they were this infamous hijacker, then yeah, maybe. And I'm not a psychologist, of course, and I don't have any kind of medical background at all. So this is just pure speculation, but it may make that person more interesting in a way, and they might gravitate toward it, given the Robin Hood kind of media portrayal of Dan Cooper. So it might make it attractive in some form.
You said something really interesting, Jimmy, that I instantly thought was 100% true. That the people in the DB Cooper community, most of them aren't necessarily true crime fans, myself included.
Yeah, myself included either. I mean, I have a little bit of an interest in it, but I wouldn't call myself a true crime fanatic, because there's people that are very, very into it, and I'm not one of them.
What do you think it is about the DB Cooper case that attracts primarily men who are not true crime fans?
Oh boy. I could probably wax poetic about this forever, or attempt to anyway.
Go on.
I think there's so much, and as I've gotten older, because I really, in a way, kind of grew up with DB Cooper, and there's this weird intersection of, as if that's true in anyone else's case, they might be able to speak to it as well. But there's this thing where, as your worldview changes, your impression of who this guy was kind of changes as well. And I think, based on your worldview and what you think is cool or what you think is socially okay, I think that is kind of why DB Cooper has become this person of intrigue, for, like you said, predominantly males, especially males of a certain age. Tends to be, people that are a little older in the DB Cooper crowd. But one of the things that I think is the reason, I mean, and I have ideas on why DB Cooper has been this enduring figure, of course, but, on to the why in the sleuthing community, DB Cooper is kind of this persistent, barren figure. I think a lot of it has to do with how DB Cooper is portrayed, and the context is everything in this, like at the time, the way that things were in the United States, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where DB Cooper gained the most traction, in the press or whatever, things weren't very good in the Pacific Northwest in 1971. You had the economic downturn in Seattle after Boeing. You have the infamous billboard that says, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" And so I think DB Cooper kind of became almost like a euphemism for all of these feelings that people had, in a way. But also, I mean, the fact that he's always portrayed as being calm, cool, and collect, and he also fits a lot of these societal fixations that we have, or beliefs in our beauty standards and things. I think it even touches on that. You have this guy, he's tall, he's dark, they don't say he's handsome. In fact, I think somebody, it may have been Tina Mucklow, even said, the sketch doesn't capture his nastiness. But I mean, you look at the sketch.
Bill Mitchell said geeky old guy.
There you go. Right. But when you look at the sketch, I didn't know that he said that. That's really interesting. When you look at the sketches, that doesn't really, that doesn't look like a geeky old guy in the sketch. It looks like a handsome guy with olive skin. He's 6 feet tall and he's in control. And I think that that's another thing that makes him relatable is that a lot of people feel like they don't have control of their lives. Maybe they don't know that directly, or maybe that's not something that they sit there and they think, I'm not in control of my life, but it's that thing that's in the back of their head, and here's a guy who was fed up with the system, right? And I think this is the way that it's commonly touched on in the media, is that DB Cooper, part of it was about the money, but part of it was about the fact that he was really upset with whatever circumstances that were out of his control. And so he did something about it. He didn't hurt anyone, and this is kind of the narrative as the way it's been presented in newspaper and TV and things. So I've rattled on about this forever now, but basically the fact that nobody died, the fact that he was tall and dark, and that common thing with tall, dark, handsome, it's been a part of our pop culture kind of male beauty standards forever. And so you have that, and then you have the aspect of he was reportedly very well-mannered and very polite. So you have this cunning hero who only wants some money. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. And then, again, those are not my beliefs, but this is the way that he's going to portrayed. And then to top it all off, he's a daredevil too, right? He's going to lower these stairs with this bag of money and he's going to jump out. I mean, it doesn't get any more attractive than that. Not to me anyway. I think that's what kind of draws me to it too. It's like, whoa, he's going to jump out of the back of the plane, and he does it, right? And then he's never seen again. Had he been caught, or had they found his body right away, a lot of that attraction goes away, because then he's human, then he's a human being. But right now he's just a phantom. He's never seen, he's never heard from again. No one knows where he came from. He doesn't hurt anyone physically. Psychologically he did, but physically not at all. And so I think those are the things that make him attractive. I think we have a preoccupation in our society with bank robbers and people of that ilk, right? Like robbers and white collar criminals and these cunning people like that who get away with, this perfect crime. And I think that those are kind of the things around DB Cooper that have made him an enduring, attractive storyline for males, especially.
If he had done his hijacking with a knife to the throat of a stewardess instead of a bomb in a briefcase, do you think he would be glamorized today?
No, not nearly as much. And we can get into some of that other stuff too. I think that it's no small thing that he's commonly believed to have been a Caucasian male as well, and the fact that he may not have been. In fact, he wasn't really described as being Caucasian. We could get into the specifics of that, but so you have that too, and the fact that he used the bomb, right? Because that's ingenious. It takes a level of technical proficiency. You can't just be some guy, right? You have to be able to be intelligent enough to build a bomb, and so that also makes it attractive, and it makes it relatively impersonal too, because it's a somewhat impersonal way of killing people or threatening to kill people. A knife to the throat, it's way too synonymous with terrorism and terrorists and terror. And that sparks genuine fear in people. And the stewardesses and the pilots definitely did have that genuine fear. But when you're that far removed from it to where you're just an observer on the outside reading about it, it feels like, well, they weren't really in danger. The bomb probably wasn't even real anyway, so they were fine. And so that kind of makes it, and our brains do that math on their own, because we don't want him to have been a real bad guy. We want him to have been, a guy who's just a little down on his luck, and he did this daredevil stunt and got away with it. But yeah, knife to throat, no way. No. Then he's a real bad guy. I don't know why, I don't know what the psychological dividing line is, but when it gets personal and you put the knife to the throat, then things change a little bit.
I agree. As soon as I'm imagining Cooper with a knife to the throat of a stewardess, I'm like, let's go get that guy.
Right.
Like, not cool.
Not cool. Right. Somehow the bomb, it's like, it takes a level of skill to build it. And then we can endlessly prattle and bandy back and forth. Well, was it real? Was it not real? But as soon as you introduce the fact that it may not have been real, then it takes an extra layer off of his bad guy, off of him being bad. And then you peel back another layer. So it's like, well, the bomb probably wasn't real anyway. So, then suddenly you have a guy who's just kind of down on his luck. Yeah, he threatened people, but he didn't really threaten them. And so, he played out this fantasy where he had that one big score and got away and he jumped out the back like a daredevil. But when you bring in, or if he had, brought a gun aboard and fired shots off or something, that changes it too. And there were hijackers that tried things like that. And you probably haven't heard of them, most people, right? I mean,
definitely. One thing about the bomb, I'll say, though, is obviously when you hear that someone on the plane has a bomb, it's terrifying, without a doubt. But Cooper was able to calm them because they seemed to be a lot more comfortable around him afterward. I mean, Tina's sitting next to him lighting his cigarettes. Even after the passengers get off, Tina was much more concerned about being sucked out of the aircraft with the door open than she was about the bomb. So with the bomb versus a gun or a knife, if you're holding me hostage, Jimmy, and you've got a gun in your hand and it keeps moving around, no matter what, I'm never going to be comfortable. But if you had a bomb and then you started to act cool, I think that at a certain point I would be comfortable around you, knowing that you weren't going to activate that bomb.
It's a brilliant observation. Yes.
And I think that's what Cooper was able to do.
Yeah, that is a fantastic insight. That's exactly right. In my opinion, the part of the bomb too is it requires some technical things to make it work. And most people, we know what a gun is, and it's dangerous. But a bomb, it's kind of this nebulous thing. Is it dynamite? What sets off dynamite? Well, I don't really know. Most regular working class people don't know a whole lot about explosives. And so, he is the control variable in that equation because he said, I touched this wire and we all be dead is the language that Florence Schaffner used on Unsolved Mysteries years later. So you have this person who, he has to touch these things together. It's in a briefcase. They only ever saw it for a second. The rest of the time, the briefcase was mostly closed with his hand in there. And so, yeah, a gun also feels a lot less controlled. It feels more impulsive, like he's just pulling this gun out and it's so easy to fire off a round. But since we don't know how easy or not easy it is to set this ordnance off, there's that trust that you build, or that they probably built psychologically because he hadn't done it yet. And they didn't have their face in a gun, or a gun wasn't stuck in their face. And so even though it was kind of, metaphorically or even literally, it's still the fact that they could not really see it the whole time, and the fact that it required Cooper to detonate it, I think adds a whole different layer to it.
All right, let's get into what you know about the case.
Are you ready? Right. Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Let's start with the bomb. Was the bomb real, Jimmy?
Oh boy, it can't be known, of course. And for a lot of this stuff too, this is just my speculation. I don't think it can be known. And there's two schools of thought, really, or more, but there's kind of two overarching ways of looking at D.B. Cooper. And I think depending on which way you want to view who he was and what his motivations were, that can dictate, whether the bomb was real or not. If you buy in a little more to the narrative that's been portrayed of him being calm and having total control of the situation, then in order to have total control of the situation, he would have to be 100% confident that it's not going to go off. And so to be 100% confident it's not going to go off, it would need to be fake. But if you think he was more of a person that was completely mentally unstable, then it very well may have been, a live bomb. I think, and I kind of am divided by my own logic here because I don't really know, but I would say, gun to my head, no pun intended here. I would say it was probably, I've gone back and forth on this a lot. And in recent times, I really thought, well, maybe we should assume that it was real, because then the stakes are raised considerably. I think it's almost taken for granted at this point that it wasn't real. And that's just based on, a momentary glance by one of the stewardesses, and other people saying, well, dynamite it's not red like that. Well, actually, sometimes it is. I would say the bomb was probably real. If I, bottom line, I would think that it probably was. I assume that it was, and that informs my belief on the rest of who Dan Cooper is.
You got to push your chips one way or the other. You're pushing them to the bomb's real.
I'm going to push him to the bomb is real, but like I said, I go back and forth on it. It's very possible that it may have been fake. It would make sense for it to be fake, but for tonight, I think it's probably real.
I've gone from being 100% certain the bomb was fake to 95% certain the bomb was fake. And these days, I'm going to say I'm at 80% the bomb was fake, because I've heard, like yours and others, a lot of good arguments for why it would be real.
Yeah. And really, the bomb being real or not, this is like a good entry point into like the bigger pieces of the case, because whether the bomb is real or not, it's important. But the passengers believed it was real, or not the passengers, but the stewardesses believed it was real.
Well, you
the
can
pilots...
never question the authenticity of a bomb on a plane.
Right. And so even if it's not, it's almost immaterial because everyone believes it is. And so, where everybody that is important in the story believes that it is. And of course, some of the FBI on the ground thought it wasn't. Oh, that's just some road flares, I think Himmelsbach said, or thought that's, his partner said or something. But for all the key players, they had to assume it was real.
You've mentioned Cooper being in control, and the stewardesses commented that he was calm, cool, and collected, never unfriendly, and always polite. Very interesting way to describe a hijacker, and also really unique behavior for a hijacker, especially if we look at the copycats.
Right.
What do you think that tells us about who Cooper was?
I think, well, and so this is kind of interesting. I was just thinking about this earlier. So he was described as being polite. Florence Schaffner was the stewardess on the Walter Cronkite program, I believe, during those first rounds of press coverage of the hijacking. And she said, well, he actually was rather nice. But there are some things that I think kind of point away from that a little bit. There are some times where he broke character, right? Like where he is angry that the plane is taking too long to refuel. And he's not just, starting to get a little more stern. No, he's smashing his hands together saying, he's swearing and saying, it doesn't take this long, so there's those instances where, he may be well-mannered, but as far as being nice, I'm not sure that he was especially nice based on some of the things that took place, there's that instance and there's a couple other things, but for argument's sake, he was pretty nice for a hijacker. He didn't, grab anybody. He didn't want the passengers to know. He didn't want to panic. And that was, of course, strategic, but also, because mostly strategic on his end, because he didn't want people to try to rush him in the back of the plane. There's a million different reasons. But the fact that he was polite and was well-mannered, I think it points to his abilities as a manipulator more than anything else. I think the fact that he also cared deeply about what the stewardesses in particular and the pilots and perhaps the FBI thought about him. And so by being well-mannered and by being polite while threatening to kill a bunch of people, I think is very manipulative, and it also reflects at least some concern with the way that he's being perceived. And I go back to the stewardesses. I think Dan Cooper really cared about how the stewardesses saw him.
That's interesting. Why do you think that?
The main thing that really makes me think that he cared deeply about the way that he was being viewed is because, again, you have this guy who is threatening to kill people, a lot of people. You have the people aboard the aircraft, but you also have the people down below. We don't know what's going to happen when this bomb goes off. What's it going to hit down on the ground? Are we going to be over woodland in a residential little borough? Are we going to be near Seattle where it could have catastrophic implications? I think that Cooper, it was very important for him because the situation, the control that he has over the airplane, it's more of an illusion than anything else. Because in the situation, he has some of the control, but ultimately the pilots are the one flying the plane. And so they have a lot of control too. But for Cooper, who was polite and well-mannered, there are those things, but also you have the part about how he tries to give change back to the stewardess. I think these are things that he does not because he's a genuinely good person, but because, again, he's threatening to kill people. So how good of a guy could he really be? And he's extorting $200,000 from the bank. So these are not the actions of a good person. So when you juxtapose that against, oh yes, please, ma'am. Oh yes, I'll here's the change back from the drink. And then he reaches into the bank bag and tries to give the stewardesses some of the money. I think, again, that points more to him caring about the way that they see him than it does him being a genuinely good person. I think he may have been even a little bit remorseful, and him worrying about the way he's being perceived would likely lead to him feeling remorse. Lastly, there's an interesting thing in the Richard Tussaud book. Dan Cooper gave a little wave the last time that he ever saw Tina Mucklow. And I think that it's interesting. It's an interesting thing to do in that setting. Why would he do that? Why would he, was it reactionary? Was it he kind of forgot where he was for a moment? Or was it because he felt bad and he kind of gave a little wave like, goodbye, I'm not going to see you again? I don't think it was a taunt. He didn't taunt them at any other point. And I think in that little wave is a lot of humanity. And it shows that if he wasn't a good person, before the hijacking, he wanted to be a good person and he cared about the way that he was seen. And again, that's more speculation on my end, but I do think that he cared deeply about the way that the stewardesses and the pilots saw him. He never admitted if he didn't know something, if he was unsure of something. He never asked any questions. Surely he had many. I mean, was he an expert in hijacking? I mean, you have to think that there was things that weren't going according to plan, but he never let that take over. And I think that shows at least a little bit that he did care about the way people saw him.
What do you think about his age? Because if you and I are sitting around and we hear a story on the news that so-and-so hijacked this, I assume you and I are both going to think it's a guy in his mid-20s. Cooper is said to be mid to late 40s. That's a really odd age for a daring crime. It
is pretty odd. I do believe there was another gentleman. I don't believe there's a few, actually. First of all, there's Frederick Honneman, another hijacker who is similar to DB Cooper in a number of ways. And I'm sure you, Darren, are familiar with who he is.
I'm familiar with him.
Right. And he was similar in age. I think he was almost exactly the age that Cooper was described as. Matter of fact, I mean, even further, he looked like the sketch. He fit the physical description to the letter. He was a Latin man of some Caucasian lineage as well. He was about 6 feet tall. He was olive skin, brown eyes. So there are examples of hijackers in particular who are that age. And I think, rather than it being like, well, this is something a young person does, I think a lot of it has to do with, kind of the random nature of it. Of course, airplane hijackings, at least domestically, rarely ever happen anymore, or else we might have a much bigger sample size by now. And so, those things I can't speak on too much. They do seem a little bit incidental as far as, this is something a young person would do. So there was a hijacker right before Dan Cooper. I don't remember his name, but
was it LaPointe? Was the first?
It could have been
one?
LaPointe. It could have been him. But he was also the one that I'm thinking of. He was tackled. He was hit over the head with an axe. This was in Canada, I believe. I could be getting them confused. I'm not an expert on all the hijackings, but I have a passing familiarity with the important ones in the case.
I get my copycats mixed up all the time. I said so-and-so was the guy that got hit by the axe, and so-and-so was the cheeseburger guy, and I get corrected all the time.
Yeah, the cheeseburger guy. Yeah, him.
Cheeseburger guy is Glenn Tripp.
Glenn Tripp. Okay, very cool. Yeah, that's good education for me. I've heard of the cheeseburger guy. I think I heard about it from Himmelsbach. In his book, he talks about it because, he had a somewhat low opinion of who DB Cooper was. And so, he, of course, draws comparison to him, right? Like, because, oh, he's just crazy. We had a guy looking for a hamburger the other day, that kind of thing. But, as far as the age, I think there's little doubt in my mind that he was the age that they described him as. And I think there's a variety of reasons why somebody in their mid 40s would be pushed or felt that they were pushed to something as potentially catastrophic as what Dan Cooper did. It's an interesting age, the mid 40s. A lot of people, if they start to deteriorate a little bit mentally, maybe if they haven't accomplished what they thought that they would, maybe if they had built up a bunch of equity in a company or something, as far as, work equity, maybe if they had worked all kinds of different jobs and they could never get ahead, things like that. And so at that point, some people start to crack, I think, after a prolonged period of time. And we don't know, he may have had a history of mental illness. He may have came from people that had mental illnesses. We just don't know. And there's so much that we don't know. But there's no doubt. Well, there is some doubt, of course, a healthy amount. I do believe that he was probably as described. They were pretty specific. There's only a couple outliers in the eyewitnesses. Most of them said mid 40s. And so, and then somebody, I can't remember which eyewitness said 50. And then Hal Williams, who was either the gate agent or the ticketing agent, said 36 or 36 to 38 or something like that. So you do have those two folks, but Tina, who sat next to, and Williams only saw Cooper for a second. Mucklow is the witness that I listened to the most. She spent 4 hours next to Dan Cooper or more, and she said mid 40s. And so that's what I believe on that, mid 40s.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Tina says mid 40s, and then Bill Mitchell says late 40s. And
yeah,
I really like Bill Mitchell's testimony because he gets a look at Cooper like many others did, but nobody else had a reason at all to pay attention to him. It was just another guy in a business suit. I didn't pay attention at all. But Bill Mitchell looked at him and was jealous that Tina was giving this guy attention because he was a young college guy and Tina was a smoke show. Yep. So yeah, he was like, what the heck is this geeky old guy doing getting all this attention from her? So he got at least one good look at him to think like, what is up with this guy?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about it that doesn't get talked about a lot, and I have, for everything about the case, I kind of have a theory I've developed, or an opinion at the very least. Not like that's a difficult thing to come up with, but I think that Cooper was definitely a middle-aged guy. And one of the reasons I believe this, and probably the main reason, and we can get into the stewardesses and stuff too at some point. But Tina Mucklow was 22 at the time?
Yeah, 22.
A 22-year-old female. Now, for Robert Rackstraw in particular, he had just turned 27. He'd only been 27 for a month. That's 4 years difference in age between her and Robert Rackstraw. How common is it going to be to sit next to somebody that is a few years older than you and you think, oh my goodness, I thought you were 50. Like, no, it's just not believable at all. And women, and I don't mean to speak for women, I think they have a better gauge of these things as well, especially 100%. For men.
I totally agree.
They're constantly assessing, unfortunately, especially, back then, every man that they come into contact with, they have to immediately run a check through like 50 different things. And one of those things is they have to assess the threat level. And one of those factors is age. How old is this person? How much of a threat to me could this person be? And so their power, especially because Tina was already on high alert, she was so alert that she had the presence of mind to jot down the things that happened within minutes of the hijacking. She was in the cockpit, as soon as she was sent to the cockpit, she was jotting things down, taking notes. She knew that she was going to be asked to describe this guy. And so she was very aware, and she was a very important witness, the most important witness. Without her, we don't have a clue who the guy is. And so, most of what we know about the entire case comes from Tina Mucklow. And so if you have faith that she saw him tying the bank bag around his waist or arbitrary facts like that, if you give her the benefit of the doubt there, it doesn't make any logical sense to say, oh yeah, but people are mistaken all the time. I'm sure that she was just mistaken. It's like, like people that the McCoy people do this a lot. Like, oh, well, yeah, I'm sure that, how reliable are eyewitness testimony anyway? It's like, okay, well, we don't have flight recorder data. So if she is totally off base and incorrect about that, well, what can we believe then? Where do we start? She must have been wrong about a lot more, I would think. And so anyway, I believe her description, and I believe the age.
Let me ask you this, Jimmy. Excluding costumes, how many times have you worn makeup in your life?
Never.
Okay. It would be the same for me also.
Right.
If I put makeup on and sat next to a 22-year-old woman who, at the very least, has likely been wearing makeup every day for about 4 years, more likely 6 or 8.
Good point.
How likely would she be able to tell if I was wearing makeup?
She would know right away.
Right away.
She would know right away.
She's sitting close enough to light his cigarettes for him. You're telling me she would notice 1971 makeup that you could get over the counter? It's not like some professional Hollywood thing. Even go look at a Hollywood movie from 71.
Yep.
How great is the makeup in that movie? And can you tell me if that actor is wearing makeup?
Well, yeah, and the whole notion, right, is just absurd. It's an invented counterpoint to try to explain why, and this is the problem with a lot of these suspects, the commonly debated ones. They all have to have some mechanism to explain some big discrepancy, like with Richard McCoy. Richard McCoy was a white guy that was 29 years old and had pale skin and blue eyes. Wow, he was wearing makeup. Or, and he did wear makeup.
And an accent and a lisp.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We know that now. And that's a relatively new development as far as it being widely known. But, we know he wore makeup on, during his hijacking. And it looked terrible. And it didn't fool anybody. So he was really good at wearing makeup when he was Dan Cooper. But then when he was James Johnson, I think is the pseudonym he used during the other hijack, suddenly he's terrible at it and he wore a big stupid wig. Like, I mean, come on, man. It just doesn't make any logical sense, and that goes to the whole McCoy thing, which I'm sure, we'll get to that. But as far as this is concerned, No, he wasn't wearing makeup. And the other part of it is, I believe the FBI asked the stewardess, I'm not sure which one, I think it was Tina, whether they believed he was wearing any type of disguise. And this is in the FBI 302s. And she said no, that she didn't believe
only
that he
sunglasses.
was. Oh, and only for part of the time. He had his sunglasses off in the beginning. He only put them on when they were taken off. He took them off again when they landed in SeaTac.
He took them off. He put the sunglasses on after he passes the note.
Right. Yep. Right as they're taking off. And then when they land, he has the cabin dimmed, and he has the shades drawn. And so he doesn't need the sunglasses. So he takes them off. And I think that it's reasonable that part of it was a disguise. But honestly, I think he put the sunglasses on because they were taken off and they're going to be above the clouds when the sun was going down. I don't think he took many steps to obscure his identity at all. He didn't seem the least bit concerned about disguising who he was.
He definitely didn't. Let me ask you this.
Mhm.
Was this thoroughly planned out, or was it done on a cocktail napkin that afternoon?
Okay, yeah. So now we're getting into some of the more interesting, like this. This is, and I break from people here in a big way. I don't think that he came up with it that afternoon, but I don't think he had it meticulously planned out. I think a lot of it was improvised, a lot more of it than is commonly believed, because there's so many things that he couldn't possibly have accounted for when he is boarding the plane. First of all, this is the night before Thanksgiving. It's a milk run to Seattle from Portland. It's about a 20-minute flight, 45-minute flight. In any case, it is a light journey that is done all the time. It's in the evening time. He could not have known how many people were going to be on this plane. So that's important. So what if the plane is full? Does he not do it? Did he wait around till he got, he's like, well, because you couldn't. I presume it hasn't been mentioned anywhere. Maybe he asked how full it was. The ticket agent didn't remember him asking anything like that. So
no, and it's debatable if he asked if it was a 727 or not.
Exactly. And that's a whole different problem in the DB Cooper world, right?
Yeah.
So what we think. He couldn't have known how full the plane was going to be. And if he did, if it was full, why not get on the plane first? That way it secures your seat, right? What if somebody else sat in the back row? That changes everything. Then he can't sit back there and control the plane from the back. Things lined up for him in ways that made it perfectly conducive to it being what it was. How would he know that he was going to get a crew that was going to comply? He would have no way of knowing that. Just a year or two before, there was a disastrous hijacking where the FBI shot out the tires and the hijacker shot and killed one of the stewardesses or one of the hostages that they took. Just a little while before that, one of the people that were part of the flight crew hit somebody over the back of the head with an axe. Like, he couldn't have known. He lucked out with the crew he got. And you could attribute that to skill, by not letting the passengers know and by being calm. I'm not going to argue that fact. He was those things, but also the crew, the people in control of the aircraft, complied with him in his every demand. What if the pilot was like, all right, folks, we are being hijacked here. Then what? He couldn't have known that they were going to comply. And he couldn't have known, how full the plane was going to be, which is a point I already touched on. But there's all of these things that he cannot plan for. Then you have, and there's a whole different psychological component to where, I don't believe that DB Cooper was a master criminal. I think he made tons of mistakes. He made a lot of little mistakes, but one very big mistake. And that is that he got the money and he dug around in a little bit, and then he let the passengers off before the parachutes were on the plane. And so that is a huge tactical mistake. At that time, the cockpit was unsecured. They could have escaped through the window, the crew in the front of the plane. Tina Mucklow, Florence Schaffner was gone. She got off the plane before Tina did. He sends Tina out to get the parachutes. It's just him with the bomb and the money and pilots he can't see. It's just a tactical mistake. But again, at that point, a different crew may have exited through the window, and then he would have been caught, and we wouldn't even know who DB Cooper was. So,
well, that's where the bomb being real really comes into play.
Right. And so, no, and there's a million little reasons why I don't think that he had it masterfully planned out. There's the whole bit about how he probably wanted to jump as soon as the plane got to altitude, how he fumbled with the stairs and couldn't get them down, how he had to be shown how to do it. Those are inconvenient for those. And I want to believe that he was this amazing, masterful criminal too. I did for a long time, until I read the FBI 302s, and it changed the way I saw him. Unfortunately, right, for my little fantasy about who DB Cooper was and the fact that, he pulled off this amazing hijacking and he didn't hurt anyone. But the fact that he fumbled with the stairs, and I went back and forth with people about this. Well, no, he didn't. He knew how to do it, but no, he didn't. He had to be shown how to do it, and it took him 25 minutes to get him down. He couldn't have possibly accounted for where he was at when he jumped out of the plane. He didn't, he didn't choose the gear. He didn't bring it aboard the plane. He relied on people down below. He leaves so much to chance. And so, no, I don't think that he meticulously planned it out. I think he had a kind of a general idea, and, it was, he knew the bigger beats, right? He knew that he was going to hijack a 727. He knew that he wasn't going to tell the passengers and that he was going to use a bomb. I think he knew he was going to say fly to Mexico. So those things, yes. But the rest of it, to anyone thinking that the whole time he's just exerting this masterful force over the aircraft, it's a load of bunk. It's just, it doesn't hold water because it's all out of his control. He doesn't know how people are going to react. He doesn't know if Billy Mitchell or William Mitchell is going to jump up from his seat and tackle him. So if any one of those things happens, which he could not have accounted for, you would never heard of DB Cooper.
All right. How did DB Cooper know that plane could be jumped? How did he know the flight configuration? How did he know how long it would take to refuel that plane? But like you said, he also didn't know how to lower the aft stairs, which is a really odd combination of knowledge.
I love this. I often wished people would ask me questions like this. I annoy everybody all the time talking about this stuff. Like I said, it comes and goes. But anyway, boy, any number of different ways. And again, this is speculation. At this point, it cannot be known. But I think that rather than being a pilot, although I'm not going to rule out the pilot thing, I think it is possible that he was a pilot at some point in time. There was a man. Oh, I had his name written down, and then I didn't bring it in here. He wrote a book about hijackers in the early 1970s.
Is it called The Skyjacker?
Yes, that's the one. Yes.
I have that book. David Hubbard.
Right. Okay. David Hubbard. And so David Hubbard.
I haven't read that book, by the way, but I did buy it for my collection.
Very cool. It's not a great book. So you're not missing out on much, but I felt it was worth a read. And there's 2 copies of it. There's 2 versions. There's like a first printing, and then 7 or 8 years later, they printed another one, and there's a little addendum in there about DB Cooper. And that is such a difficult book to find. I don't know how I ended up with a copy of it, but I just randomly bought the book on the internet. And then a while later, I found another copy at a thrift store, and it didn't have that in it. And come to find out, it's pretty hard to get one that does have it in there. And it talks a little bit about his psychological profile of who he believed Dan Cooper was. And this is a guy that had worked extensively with profiling the different hijackers, which was a tall order at the time because, you had the political extremist hijackers, and you didn't really have a whole lot of people like DB Cooper. And so there was a pretty small sample size because you can't say and this is some of the flaws in his research as well. And his research has a lot of flaws. He makes a lot of presumptions that D.B. Cooper probably had a mom that didn't like him very, like stuff like this, where it's like, well, is that rooted in science, or are you just thinking that? Just because you strongly believe that doesn't mean that that's, academically very responsible to put that in there. I think personally that the Boeing angle has not been as ruled out as people want to claim, right? Like, well, we looked at the Boeing engineer's tie and it doesn't have the particles on it. Okay, that's a Boeing engineer. What about the tool and die shop workers? These were people that worked with metals. They made tools for working on planes, and they repaired certain components of the planes. Hundreds, if not thousands of people worked in the Boeing tool and die shop. They would have had access to the different schematics used for the various airplanes. They would have had, they worked for Boeing. They would have worked for Boeing. So if, let's say, Dan Cooper concocts this idea of, maybe he reads about another hijacker in the newspaper and it's like, that is a great idea. And he already is there, working in the airline industry, then all he has to do is do a little research, talk to some pilots, talk to some people he works with, little by little over a period of time. Or conversely, I think maybe he could have been a ramp agent or something like that. Someone who had experience inside airplanes, inside aircraft, a working knowledge of how they worked. Generally, people that work around airplanes or in the airline industry, even if they're not flying the planes or designing the planes at the ground level, they're generally interested in aviation in some way. And so I think the way that Dan Cooper figured these things out was probably through a little bit of planning, for sure, but I think he had that much planning done anyway. I think he knew that the 727 could be jumped from, going into it, right? Because I think a lot of it was improvised, but I think that much he had figured out going in, obviously, right? That you can lower the stairs and jump out of this type of plane. So, and this is just one possible explanation, that he was a ramp agent or a mechanic for an airline. Airlines had their own mechanics back then. Many of them did. He could have been affiliated in some way with the aviation industry. I think that's a safe bet. As for the particles on his tie, I think that might point to him working in an area like the tool and die shop. They used all kinds of different metals. Titanium was not quite as rare as I think as we've been led to believe. A lot of different industries used titanium. And so he definitely, in my opinion, was a airline worker in some capacity or a Boeing employee. I lean toward Boeing employee because they had huge layoffs, and it just makes sense logically that he worked for a company like that. That company in particular, it's in the Pacific Northwest. They laid off 3,000 people. There's all these different divisions and branches. There's dozens and dozens of places he could have worked. So to just rule it out because, well, we looked at an engineer's tie and it doesn't look like his tie, so I guess he didn't work for Boeing. No. It needs to be way more thoroughly investigated than that. So that's how I think he knew those things. He worked in around planes and did a little asking around.
Do you think Cooper had military experience? Do you think that's where he learned to parachute?
It's possible. Honestly, my kind of general composite, and this might, be a little more useful if I just establish this now. I think that Dan Cooper was somebody that didn't have a lot of success in his life, professionally, personally. Success, I don't measure success by monetary means. I'm not saying that he didn't have a lot of money, but he didn't have a lot of money, but either way. So by whatever metric we use in society to deem whether or not somebody is successful, personally, privately, professionally, interpersonally, I don't think he had a lot of success in those areas. And so in terms of what he did for a living, I think that it was something involved in the aviation industry that didn't pay that well. What was this rude question again? Sorry about that.
Do you think he had military experience?
Oh,
especially
right.
parachuting?
See, I can birdwalk in this stuff and then just end up in La La Land, totally turned around.
That's okay. That's kind of the point of the show.
Right. I think, yes. Yeah, I do think he probably had some military experience. And that, right. And the point that I was going to make is I think it's very possible that Dan Cooper was a guy who was always outside the window his whole life, always looking in. He saw people parachuting and he wanted to do it. Like as far as, in the military, I don't believe he belonged to a MACSOG unit or a special forces unit. I don't believe it. I haven't seen any evidence of it. That works from the presumption that he survived, and there's no evidence of that, which is the $1 million question, right? But which I'm sure is going to be the last bit of the podcast, but not to spoil anything. But that works from the assumption. It gives him the benefit of the doubt at every turn, and I think that logic has gotten us nowhere. Instead of giving him the benefit of the doubt all the time, I think it's time to kind of push back on some of these things and be like, well, maybe not. So to that end, I do believe he was in the military, but I don't think that it was in a special forces unit or anything like that. He may have been a pararescue or a paratrooper at some point, possibly. I would think that he probably was something like that, maybe, which again has always been kind of an elite area of the military, but we don't know if he ever really jumped out in combat. There's a million little factors there. It could be a million reasons why, that profile of a guy who is never really the guy, who's not this strapping, handsome, heroic guy. Maybe he was in one of these units, but he never saw action, or he got hurt and he wasn't able to continue on, earlier in his life. And so, parachuting was something he was always interested in. But I don't think he had extensive parachuting experience. He may have. I think it's immaterial in a way, because a lot of these things, I mean, it is important, but whether or not he was in the military, I'm not sure. Probably. And he probably jumped out of planes in the military, but special forces, I'm not sure.
Cooper is described as carrying an attaché case or a briefcase. And then there's also reports of him having some sort of mystery bag. It could be canvas, it could be paper. We have no idea what's in that bag. So I'm asking you to speculate. What do you think's in that bag, Jimmy?
I'm not gonna, again, oh my goodness, these questions. I've just been waiting my whole life. I'm bird walking. I talk about this stuff with whoever will listen in my circle all the time, but and go back and forth on the internet, but to keep it as succinct as possible, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe he had some kind of provisions in there as far as for the cold. He did disappear to the bathroom for a little while. He may have put something on, I think somebody earlier spotted some kind of funny undergarment that he may have been wearing. And so in the bag, he may have had, he may have had some kind of clothing for the ground, some kind of thing to change into when he landed. So that way he wasn't the only guy jumping out of a freaking airplane in a jacket and, in slacks. He may have had a sweatshirt or a sweater or something like that in there for warmth. And of course, this is complete speculation. I have no idea, but probably something for his jump, I would think.
Do you think he had a drop zone in mind?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do. I think he wanted to get out of that plane as soon as they got to altitude. I think he wanted to jump out of the plane right as it got high enough to jump out safely, which would have put him somewhere in the Tacoma area, in the Seattle, Tacoma area. That's where he wanted to jump out of the plane. That's part of my theory on why I think he wanted the stairs down on takeoff, which he did. they went back and forth over it. And I think Cooper, and this kind of goes along with my general ideas of who he is as a person, I think he acquiesced and was like, whatever, because he was not afraid to improvise a little bit. He had demonstrated that earlier, that he didn't really care. Mexico City, whatever. No, can't make it there. How about Phoenix? No. Okay. How about San Francisco? No. How about, Reno? Sure. So that improvisation, I think, comes in handy. But yeah, I think that he wanted to jump out as soon as they got to altitude, and that's why he wanted those stairs down. He knew he didn't know how to lower them, and so he wanted them down so he didn't have to fumble around in case it was difficult. And again, total speculation, but that's what I believe. So yeah, I think he missed his the drop zone he wanted, and it goes again to the criminal psychology of criminals. And Dan Cooper was a criminal, even if he wasn't earlier in his life. I think he probably was, but maybe not a whole bunch of criminals.
The Dan Cooper we know certainly was a criminal.
Right. Yes. And so criminals make mistakes. They don't think things through all the way a lot of the time. I work in criminal arraignments. I see this all the time. When you ask them, well, what are you going to do if you get caught? They don't ever consider getting caught. A lot of them, they don't think about that. And so as far as Dan Cooper and his drop zone, I think he just figured, well, I'll get the stairs will be down as soon as we take off, and I'll jump out and I'll be I think he probably lived in the Seattle Tacoma area. And so he, if he worked for Boeing or he worked for an airline, or if he was a pilot even, it makes sense that he would want to jump out near where he lives. And so I think his drop zone was in that area. I think he did not want to jump out as far south as he did.
I think that's very interesting because he did ask to take off with the stairs down. And even more interesting than that, the pilots refuse to do that because they believe it's unsafe. And Cooper tells them that it's possible, but he's not going to argue with them. He'll just lower them in flight. And even with like the CIA, Vietnam 727 planes that were used to drop gear and troops, I don't believe they ever took off with the stairs down. There's just no reason to do that.
No.
So
and there's no record of them doing it.
how did this guy know that the plane could take off with the stairs down? That's even more impressive to me than knowing the flight configuration for jumping out of that plane.
Well,
because nobody was doing that.
Right. Let me play devil's advocate here.
All right, let's party.
Why would he need to know that? What would prevent them from taking off with the staircase down? It's scraping across the ground. Big deal. Plane's still going to get in the air.
There's two, I don't want to say schools of thought, two theories here, because there's a position where the stairs are locked down, where taking off would potentially be impossible because it would do damage structurally to the aircraft. And then there are the stairs just falling down where they can be pushed back up against the hydraulics. And you can all pull up a video on YouTube. Forgive me, I can't remember the name, but there's a video of a 727 taking off where people are trying to run up the back stairs.
Oh, interesting.
And this has got to be like 10 years plus after the hijacking. And I just struggle to think who would know that plane could take off with the stairs down. The pilots didn't even know if the plane could fly with the stairs down, but Cooper knew that it could take off with them down.
Yeah, that's true. I would counter by saying a little bit, and I agree with you. That is one way of looking at it. I kind of look at it like, maybe he just assumed that it could, and I
Totally
think Cooper
possible.
was definitely, like I said, I think he cared what people thought of him. I think he did not want to be gaffed. I don't think that he wanted to look like an idiot. I think he wanted to look intelligent. I think he wanted to look like he knew what he was doing. Um, he has a counter for everything, like he doesn't just say, oh, you're right. Never. He always comes back with something. To me, that doesn't say he's a genius. That says that he's a smartass and wants to act like he knows everything and is pushing back on every little thing, like, well, whatever, we can do it this way. That is, and I don't really believe that, but that is a different way of looking at it. It's like, well, who's to say? I mean, what if the pilot was like, or what if the pilot was like, okay, fine, or what if something developed a little differently? That might color our view of who he was and what choices he made. It's a nothing comment to say, oh, we can, but we won't. Like, okay, what does that even mean? Prove that you're not going to prove that we can. You could just have said that, but again, you can't really do that, right? Because that's almost the same thing as saying, well, maybe the tie wasn't his. Maybe the stewardesses were wrong. We have to assume that there was a reason that he thought that you could. And so to your point, I don't know. I don't know what person knows that. Somebody that, he may have been intelligent in aviation, with airplanes. He may have been a big aviation nerd, and known, without the lived experience that it was possible. It's more likely that something obviously led him to knowing that, of course. But on its own, I don't know if it's enough to really come up with a composite profile of who this guy may have been. I do think that he had a lot of experience in airplanes. He referred to the phone as the interphone. He referred to the stairs as the air stairs, when it came to deplane. This is a guy, and Tina, this stuck out to her. She was like, oh, and this is important because, again, I think women are very keen on details like this, because of their mothering intuition. Their perception of danger is different than men's. And I think that they're just, in general, hopefully, I don't get any heat for this, but I think that they're just better at these kinds of things, and so the fact that it stuck out to her is important, because that means he was using it in casual conversation in a way that you and I wouldn't, and that was important. That was a detail that she found pretty curious. So who's the guy that knows this about the stairs? I'm not sure, but I do think it is highly, highly likely that Dan Cooper worked around airplanes, which is probably why he hijacked one.
Yeah, the interphone comment, they were quick to point that out, that was industry jargon.
Right. And that's something that, most people, even though it is industry jargon, are not going to really know, and that's something that only a meticulous person would say. I work, in a field where there's all kinds of technical jargon as far as like different types of forms and different laws and different things. I never refer to stuff by its proper name, even if I know it, so this is a guy who it was important to refer to these things as their proper name. And I think it does have something to do with the fact that he did not want to look like an idiot. He wanted them to think he knew exactly what he was doing. That, again, my opinion on that one. But
all right, here's a super hot question for you. Do you think it's possible that Cooper never jumped from the airplane and then somehow in Reno he casually escapes from the aircraft?
Yeah. I think it's possible also that he jumped and then got abducted by aliens right away. I mean, no, that's ridiculous. And that's usually, like people that are like natural, like skeptics, right? Like that. And I am a skeptic, but that's like your first, that's like people have one of like three first opinions on DB Cooper. It was Richard McCoy. It was that he never got off the plane. Or it was that, what does it matter? He died anyway, or something like that, and so if you take away that one, it was McCoy or he stayed on the plane. But those seem to be the prevailing ones that have endured, no, they had the whole airport surrounded. They had every FBI agent and local provincial cop in the whole freaking area.
They searched the plane with dogs.
They searched the plane with dogs. They had the whole perimeter of the airport surrounded. No, he wasn't on the plane. He took off.
All right, how about this? I've got two theories for you.
Mm-hmm.
They're all along the same vein. One is that Cooper never existed and the flight crew cooked it up.
Right.
The other is that Cooper was in on it with the flight crew. So Cooper exists and he does jump out of the plane, but he's totally in on it with the flight crew. What do you think of those two theories?
Which was the first theory, that he
Cooper never existed and the flight crew made him up?
It's hard to even know what to respond to that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, wouldn't it be easier just to hijack the plane yourself? Why, why? What is the motivator? The money? Where are you going to land the plane? As soon as you land the plane, if there's no person there, but not only that, so people can't keep good secrets like that. First of all. Second of all, when has that ever happened before? Third of all, there was people that saw him in the airplane and at the airport. So now it's a conspiracy with everybody aboard the aircraft, the ticketing agent, the pilots, the stewardesses. Give me a break. This stuff drives me nuts.
Those seem to be the theories that people come to when they hear the story. And it's like, oh, I know. He never existed. The flight crew made it up. Or I know he never jumped and then casually walked off the plane in Reno.
Oh, and I could freak out on this a lot harder. And I do, like, a lot of the times in my head when I'm responding to stuff, because I don't really respond to those, but I mean, it's like almost a perfect troll for like the DB Cooper people, because like if I was a troll, that's what I would say, right? I would be like, oh, this is gonna drive him nuts. And so, to me, I mean, it's just ridiculous, and a spade is usually a spade. Things are usually not too far from what they really are. Now, there are instances, of course, many, where things are totally not as they seem, but that's more rare than things being largely the way that they are. There's no motivation to do that from the pilots and the stewardesses. They think they're going to get away with that, so they're all criminally, insane. What's more likely that these even if it was just the pilots and the stewardesses, so these 7 people are all hijackers psychologically.
7 people with great jobs they loved and continued doing.
And exactly. I mean, it's just so absurd that there's just not, I mean, how many different ways can we shut the stupid theory down? It's millions. It's just like, it melts my brain.
I only ask those questions because the more people that can just totally poo-poo that point, the better, because I absolutely hate getting those. I would rather answer 100 McCoy was Cooper emails than Cooper never existed emails. It just drives me crazy.
Oh, it drives me crazy too. The McCoy ones drive me nuts too, because I think that it's one person with a bunch of different accounts, or a couple people with a bunch of different accounts. And the McCoy stuff really drives me nuts because, and the Rackstraw stuff, those two in particular, Kenny Christensen theory. I like the gentleman who wrote that book. I know he's a polarizing figure and he's an unpopular guy in the DB Cooper world, but even though I don't agree with him on much, I don't think he's a bad guy. The same cannot necessarily be said for some people that push other suspects. For the Richard McCoy thing, that stuff drives me berserk. Like those other questions drive you mad, that one drives me crazy, and the Rackstraw one. But not many people believe it's Rackstraw. Only really one guy that I can think of.
When the 2016 History Channel documentary came out, I had emailed Robert Blevins and Bruce Smith a couple of times, and that was like the extent of my involvement in DB Cooper. And that Rackstraw doc came out in 2016, and I emailed both of them, and I was like, What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
And then both of them were just like, I was shocked that it was Rackstraw. I can't believe they retreaded this ground.
Oh, like for the one that just came out, the Netflix one?
No, in 2016, it was DB Cooper case closed ?
Wasn't that the first one that did the Rackstraw stuff, or no?
That was the first one. So interestingly, the two Rackstraw ones both essentially end with it's not Rackstraw, which
yeah, I mean,
part of me feels bad for Colbert about that, but
I don't, and and I don't want to disparage anybody, unless I feel like they are a little bit malignant or malicious in the way that they present information. And I'm not going to draw any specifics or anything, but sometimes I get the impression that some of the information may not be correct, and that might not be an accident, just from that general suspect. I'm not going to say any specifics, but there is one point in the documentary where somebody that is a big fan of Robert Rackstraw says that, and the stewardesses specifically said he was wearing a disguise. I don't remember who it is, but that is a blatant falsehood. They specifically said he was not wearing a disguise, but it's the things like that. And that is deliberate. I feel like it's deliberate anyway. So that kind of stuff, like really, really, for some reason, burns my saddle, I swear. Because I feel like a manipulation of the facts. If you have a suspect and it makes you feel so strongly that you don't care what you have to do, you just need to make people believe it. Like, I don't understand the logic. I don't understand it.
Well, I don't think that's limited to Rackstraw and McCoy. I think a lot of this isn't my term, but it's been used on the show, so I'll use it. Suspect peddlers
yeah,
will tend to emphasize things in the case that agree with their suspect and intentionally avoid things that disagree with their suspect.
Yeah, and I think it's a huckster move. It's, do you really want to solve this, or do you want to get the credit for solving it? Right? Like, if that's what it's about, and
that's a very interesting distinction.
Right. And it is about getting the credit for it for a lot of people. Myself, like, I have a little bit of that too, of course, but I'm not willing to let some pursuit of glory interfere with what I know to be true. And when I have somebody that and I don't have a lot of suspects, I have researched in various areas looking for suspects, and have developed a few people where I'm like, oh, this is interesting. As soon as I really scrutinize the suspect. I don't look away from the stuff that says like, oh, well, that's clearly not him. I lean into that stuff, because that's what you do as a researcher. You are the biggest critic of your information, regardless of whether or not you want to be persuasive. Let the facts persuade people, because if they don't stand on their own, then it's not genuine. And what kind of credit is that anyway? Why? Like, if deep down, but maybe they don't, I think some of them do, but if deep down that you arrived at this conclusion based on spurious information or things that are untrue, what glory is there in that? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. People have put so much work into this and believe it's one way. And I feel like sometimes the amount of work they've put in, they can't say, oh my gosh, I was wrong.
That's unfortunate. Yeah,
I
agree with you 100%.
Like, myself, I don't want to be standing up and saying something when other people are like, dude, that's wrong. I would just rather be like, oh, you guys are right. I made a mistake there. I was wrong.
Of course.
Let's move forward.
Yeah.
But I think if I had tied myself to Billy Bob Johnson, he's my suspect. It's 100% him. I've spent 10 years working on this guy. To after the 10 years have a document come out where it's like, dang, it's not Billy Bob. I like to think that I could say, hey guys, I was wrong about this. but I don't know, because I haven't done that.
Yeah.
So I do feel for some of the people that have been longtime proponents of suspects that most would agree, oh, it's definitely not this guy, but they're still out there, holding up the torch for him.
100%. Yeah. And I haven't been in that position either. I will say, I think it takes a lot of deliberate looking away from any of the major suspects that have been discussed in the beginning, And so as a human being, I think I empathize with whatever personality, that leads people to not be able to look at things objectively as far as, and I'm not perfect either, obviously. Like, I don't look at things objectively all the time. With DB Cooper stuff, I try to the best of my ability, but, and it doesn't even really need to be said that I'm not perfect. I'm very far from it. But with this stuff where, it's like, okay, in the first 5 minutes, it's not him, read the description of the guy. Does that fit your suspect? No, then it's not him. Move on. But so I do think there's some deliberate and, within reason, we don't really know what he looked like. We have a facsimile, but we don't really know what he looked like. So I'm willing to go a margin of error a little bit and be open-minded. But, if he's a half a foot shorter or, completely bald, or he has blue eyes and pale skin, it's not him. It's not him. So you have to look away at certain key points. And so to that part, I empathize with the personality that it takes, or sympathize rather, with that type of individual that can't, for whatever reason, look away when they know that this is not how it is, because they all have those moments where they're like, oh man, it's not him. But they, I would argue, choose to ignore that and move on and keep harping on it. And so to me, that's unfortunate. And I'm glad that I don't have that, but I see how somebody could, and it's unfortunate.
Well, you don't have that yet. You could be locked into a suspect
Right.
tomorrow. I'll be talking to you when you're 41 and
Well,
you'll be
right.
denying facts.
Right. I have that in other areas of my life, many other areas of my life. I have a lot of blind spots, but with DB Cooper, I'm able to keep it pretty objective, I feel. And what's really objective anyway? Is total objectivity ever possible? No, probably not. And so I think I'm being objective, but I think I'm being more objective than a lot of people that are peddling suspects.
Do you think the flight path is accurate?
The flight path is one of those things where, man, probably, maybe not. I kind of tend to believe that it might not be 100%, down to the last pin, accurate. And you mentioned his name, and so I don't, and I'm not saying anything bad about him. I actually quite like Mr. Blevins. I think he's a nice guy. And he gave me a little schooling on the flight path somewhat recently, and he believes that there is enough evidence to say yes, it is 100% accurate. I don't think so, not 100%. And the reason I don't think so is because where you find money is where that money got there after it left the plane. Using powers of deduction, what makes the most sense? The only thing that we don't really know 100%, because we don't have that information, is where the plane precisely was. Radicek was flying. He was hand flying. He himself called his flight path a zigzag. The only thing it takes for that money to get there, and the money is hard evidence, where that money is, Cooper was, at least in that area. The Washougal River, I don't believe in the Washougal washdown theory. And I don't think that the money got there from another tributary of the Columbia River, not the Lewis River, not the Washougal River. So you have hard evidence on the ground, and that means something. What does it mean exactly? Well, I don't think it means, and I'm not going to birdwalk into this, but for me, I don't believe for a second that it was left behind deliberately. No way. I don't believe it. So for me, that means that the plane was obviously somewhere over that area, in that general area. He could have drifted to that area. Maybe, you know, maybe he jumped and landed in the river, and over time his body moved to the closer to the Tina Bar, and we can get into that. But either way, I don't think it's 100% accurate. I don't have the information, and I don't believe anybody does. Not the information that we need to know if it was 100% accurate. And we can go even further on this, like, well, how accurate was the radar? Because according to Mr. Blevins, the plane, the closest it got to Tina Bar was 6 miles, I believe. 6 miles, that's pretty freaking close when we're talking, flying over, considering the fact that Cooper had a parachute that he couldn't steer. Suddenly, I think it becomes a little more plausible that, maybe, Radicek zigged a little further than he thought, a little further than the flight information shows. It wouldn't have to take very much. But before, I thought that, no way. I thought it was just off by a little bit, and he obviously landed somewhere near Tina Bar. They found money there, and that money was tied to his body. So logic for me says he was in that area. And so he's only, he is so far. When he's in that area, he is really far from where the FBI was looking, where the original drop zone was. It has to be off, and of course I can't say that 100% because I don't have the empirical information. It would need to be tested. And I think you could find out by studying that money. You could come up with a bunch of different scenarios, but the money, in my opinion, is the key to the whole thing. The money that we do have, the $6,000 or the $5,800, $5,820, I think, as much of that as could be collected, as much of that is in private hands, I think you could find out all kinds of information based on that money. And they have, but there's a lot more that could be found. So the roundabout way of saying, I don't think that the flight path is 100% correct.
So this leads into two of my other questions at the same time. So I assume you don't believe the FBI's drop zone is correct. And then you also believe that the money arrived on Tina Bar via a Western flight path.
Yeah. And again, I am not a scientist. I don't have a qualification so far as, I have done the math and I have looked at it. I haven't. I can't say that. This is all speculation, although I kind of argue that it's not 100% speculation. And the reason is because we have physical evidence, and where that physical evidence is found is critical to positioning that plane. It's not really there's not much mystery in it. If you allow, as your main variable, the money, what does the money tell us? Where would the plane have to be? And I'm not saying this is the conclusion to the research, but figuring out where the plane, because this is not, proper science. You don't have your conclusion and then try to prove it, right? But you may not need to do that because you have physical evidence. You have the empirical data. The data is the money. And so you find exactly where the plane would have to be and then compare that to the original flight path. And if it's ridiculously off, then, the original flight path might be correct. So then you move on to the next scenario, and people have done this ad nauseum. I appreciate that. I understand. But, I think the money got there by natural means. I do. And I don't think it traveled a great distance either.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, I just, and of course I'm flexible on these things. These are my opinions. I'm not married to any of these. If somebody showed me some evidence of a really good suspect, I looked at the picture and I looked at the sketch and he checks all the boxes, and actually checks some, not just sort of in the ballpark, checks some. Then I could be he must have lost some of it. Then maybe he put some in the briefcase and lost that, and that washed down. There's any number of different theories, but as it is now, I think that money was on the bottom of the Columbia River, and whatever that means for Dan Cooper, you can decide. But for me, that's the only thing that makes logical sense. And I understand the information about the diatoms. I get it. There was no seasonal diatoms from when he jumped, but there's a huge caveat with this. The money was protected when it hit the water. Tina Mucklow, saw it. She said it was wrapped in nylon parachute. It's unclear whether that was also with the bank bag, whether he took the money out of the bank bag, put it in the nylon parachute, then bundled it all up with the 50 plus feet of shroud line from one of the parachutes he didn't use. But I think it's, again, it's kind of a leap of, guesswork here. I think it's safe to assume that money was in the soft cotton canvas bank bag. He wrapped that in a nylon parachute, a certain length of nylon parachute, then wrapped that, bound that all up in cord, and then attached that to his waist with a tether. So it is yet to be investigated or tested scientifically what the impact that protecting the money when it enters the waterway, what effect on the bills does providing a buffer do? So if the money enters the water and it's protected by all those different layers, so now you have a canvas bank bag, you have 20 pounds of money. So the money in the middle of the stack, how are the diatoms going to get to that money in the wintertime? So maybe, the bills that were found were from near the center of the stack, the $6,000. So for me, I think that, my theory, and I'm working on trying to test it, is that the fact that sand, and Tom Kay talks about this in his analysis, that sand acts as an insulator. Diatoms struggle to get through the sand and attach to the money. Okay, so how about a cotton bank bag, a nylon parachute, 50 feet of shroud line, and a bunch of mud on the bottom of the Columbia River? Are there diatoms at the bottom of the river? I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about diatoms. So, also rubber bands are intact. The bottom of the Columbia River, if that bundle is covered in silt and mud and soot, that environment has a lot less oxygen. Things are going to deteriorate more slowly. So now you have this big bundle, 20 pounds of money, insulated by DB Cooper, and then he enters the water. Whatever happens to him, subterfuge, doesn't matter. So I don't know what happened to him, but for the sake of argument here, he comes separated from the money somehow, or somehow the money ends up at the bottom of the river. What happens to the money? And I think that is a big question, because I don't think that the money, it's the water and the elements are going to act completely differently on naked bundles of $20 bills floating around in the river. This wasn't that scenario. They were protected. They were insulated. That bundle weighed 20 pounds. It would have sank to the bottom of the river quickly. And when it got there, it would have been covered up by mud. At least that's my idea on it. Everything else gets covered up by mud on the bottom of the Columbia River. So after a while, that whole bundle is covered in mud. The money is completely insulated. It's cold. There's not as much oxygen down there. And I would like to see what effect that has on the rubber bands and the money itself.
Based on what you've said, I'm guessing you don't believe Cooper survived the jump.
Well, I don't know. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I really don't know. Sometimes I think he did. Sometimes I think he didn't. I think in any case, the money was at the bottom of the Columbia River. That's my theory. In that area, to me, it's the only thing that makes a ton of sense. Cooper, I don't know. I don't think so. Realistically, I don't think that he did survive. He may have.
That's because you haven't read Martin Andrade's book.
Well, here's the thing: survivability of the jump, right? I'm not arguing that it was stormy, that it was torrential downpour. It doesn't need to be those things. It doesn't have to be for him not to survive. There's so much we don't know that we can't make a real convincing argument that he did survive. We don't know how much jump training he had, and I realized that, oh wait, there was hijackers who didn't have much and they survived. Okay, how many of them jumped out at night over the Pacific Northwest, dressed as we presume he was dressed? We don't know anything about Cooper, so we don't know anything about his capabilities, really. The only thing that has to happen for Cooper to not survive is he pulls a couple seconds too late. So he pulls a couple seconds too late, he doesn't survive, period. And so while the jump may have been survivable, and it may have been very survivable, we don't know, because we don't know what he was capable of. And for me, there's too many variables to really say like one way or another. I think based on the mistakes he made on the plane, of which there are ample mistakes, again, letting the passengers go before the parachutes are aboard, and many other mistakes, no disguise, he took the sunglasses off. I've been talking a lot, so I don't, those are just a couple examples, but he was capable of making mistakes. And I think that's kind of something that doesn't enter into the narrative a lot. So a guy who's already capable of making mistakes, he's already done this crazy thing. All it takes for him is to make one more little mistake and he's history. So for me, I think that that's pretty reasonable, but it also doesn't diminish the mystery for me personally. If he doesn't survive, we still don't know who he was. And that's the most attractive part of the mystery for me.
Well said. All right, now I'm going to ask you again. You have to push all your chips in. He survived or he didn't survive the jump?
This one's easier for me. No, I don't think that he did.
Ooh, very interesting.
I know that's a frustrating.
It's not frustrating. I actually kind of like it. It also puts you in the minority amongst my guests.
Right. Yeah, I understand how, and I've listened to a lot of the guests, and I've listened to a lot of people over the years and read the books and things, and I believe that he survived too. I really did. And I thought, when I was younger, first coming into the case, Dwayne Weber was the suspect of the day. This was around 2001, 2002. And that's who I believe did it, because that was the information that was available. That's who was on TV. Joe Weber was on King 5 or Cairo, and it was an affiliate network out of Florida where she was living at the time. And so, Joe Weber was convincing, like she wrapped it up nicely. He confessed on his deathbed and all these things. And Dwayne Weber, I hate to say it, because I know a lot of people don't like what Joe Weber had to say and all this stuff. I like Joe Weber. I didn't know her personally, but I think she meant well. She was just not in her right mind toward the end, especially. But either way, Dwayne Weber's a dead ringer for the physical description, a dead ringer. Like, he looks exactly like the guy they're describing. 6 feet tall, dark, mid-40s, early 50s, swarthy complexion, wavy, dark brown or black hair, brown eyes, protruding lower lip. He even has that feature. But, at the end of the day, I don't really think it is him. In any case, I don't think that he survived. Of course, I could believe that he did, but as it is now, no, I'm kind of, unfortunately, to me, it's a kind of a tragedy in a way. I don't think that it need like the hijacking and all of these things. It is cool and it is mysterious, but there is, something kind of tragic about it. And I just don't believe that he did live. And the reason is because the money, and it washed up on the bank of the Columbia River. Whether it was planted there, why on earth would he plant it there? What does that location have to do with anything? Why would he plant it somewhere near where they thought he landed? He wouldn't have even known to think of that location. It doesn't make any sense to me, because I'm going to hide it here at Tina Bar. Why? Why would you do that? Like, no one, Tina Bar hadn't even ever been discussed. The FBI never even looked there. So it's a peculiar place to leave a clue when it's never been discussed. Nobody even knew about that location. So again, that's just an odd thing. But I think where you find money, if they never found anything, no money at all, then yeah, maybe he lived. But the fact that they found it next to the Columbia River, it's crushing. I just don't, it just can only mean a couple things.
Do you think the changing sketches did damage to the case?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, I mean, damage to the case, I don't know, but I think it wasted a lot of the FBI's time, because they don't look anything alike, right? You have a lot of sketches. You have the first one that he looks pretty young. He also looks, decidedly more Latin, and they never even widely circulated that one. It's the sunglasses one, and he has the wavy hair swept back. I mean, that guy looks like he's in his mid-20s.
Yeah, he does. Big square jaw.
Yeah, square jaw, right. And I think they used Robert Gregory's description a lot more for that one. And he was the gentleman that said, well, he appeared to be, he had high cheekbones. He appeared to have Mexican American ancestry or Native American ancestry. Same guy that said he had marbled hair and a russet colored jacket.
Yeah, brown and russet colored jacket.
Right. And it's kind of weird, I don't know if I believe that necessarily. However, his physical description of how he looked, his skin color, his hair color, those things were correct. And he wasn't seated that far away. And apparently he got enough looks at him to put together a pretty good idea of what he looked like. But the money thing is a big, finding it next to the river is a big tell.
Do you think the FBI and or CIA knows exactly who DB Cooper is and they're intentionally covering it up?
No, I don't.
Why not?
What would the motivation be? They have had people on the inside of the FBI and the CIA that have been guilty of more serious crimes than DB Cooper was guilty of. And they outed them publicly, and it made them look bad. And I don't have, specific instances in this case. But
right. No need. That's fine.
Right. I just, no. That would mean Larry Carr is lying, first of all. And I don't know if there's more of a Boy Scout out there. I don't believe the man is capable of a lie of that magnitude. Of course, I don't know him, but, just from the impression I get, I think he's saying everything he knows.
I definitely think he wanted to solve it.
I do too. Yeah. And I don't think the FBI is in every instance, or in many instances, a malignant, negative, entity out there operating in secrecy. In many ways, yes, for their protection and things. And I'm not a big, and this isn't in any way an insight into my beliefs politically or anything. I just don't think that that makes any sense. What DB Cooper is such a drop in a bucket for the FBI. To us, it's a big deal. To them, it's Tuesday night.
Well said. Jimmy, how did DB Cooper get to the airport?
Oh boy, I don't even know if I could speculate too much, but I think DB Cooper is a local to the Pacific Northwest. I don't believe that he traveled a great distance. It doesn't make any sense to me that he did. And it goes to the Canadian thing. Why would you hijack a plane in America when we have the most rigid, in a prosecutorial sense, the most rigid, court system in the Western world? If he's this criminal mastermind, well, he fumbled that one. He should have hijacked a plane in Canada, because he would have done like 3 years or 5 years. That's kind of unimportant in a way to me. I just think that he lived in the area and was local either to Seattle, Tacoma, which is kind of what I believe, because I believe that he was somehow involved in the airline industry. And he probably, maybe hopped on a bus, took a train. I'm not sure, but he definitely didn't fly, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that he did. I think he was from here.
Why the name Dan Cooper?
Oh, it's tough. I go back and forth on that one. um, I'm not sure, I don't know. I guess it informs a little bit, I want it to be the comic book character. I do, but I don't, he could have got it from that. He could have. And that might mean any number of things. People are gonna use a pseudonym like that, like James Bond or something, because the character has appeal to them. It's either what they aspire to be in some way, what their fantasy is in some way, or something that they relate to. So if he did choose it because of the comic book character, um, that was someone that he either aspired to be, like somebody that he, identified with in some way, obviously, or he may have had a little bit of a sense of humor. Maybe he thought that was ironic in that he identified with the heroic and daredevil nature of that character, but he was doing something inherently cowardly and dastardly. So there was some irony there, but also that he felt that he was justified, which I do believe. I believe he was completely entitled and felt he was justified, as most criminals do. But yeah, I don't know. It could be a coincidence, but I really don't think so, to be honest. I lean more toward that it was a deliberate choice. That's one hell of a coincidence.
It is one hell of a coincidence. I hope it's the comic book.
I'm pretty sure, like, gun to my head, I would say, yeah. I mean, that is first of all, it's kind of on brand, as far as just kind of his general disposition in a lot of ways. He was described, even though I don't think that there's a ton of evidence that he was just the person that, people think that he wasn't always calm. He did freak out at multiple parts, but he was also pretty chill a lot of the time too. Robert Gregory and a couple other people, they described him as just kind of looking uninterested, that he just looked kind of sleepy and like, that he had no worry at all, that he was just, okay, at many points until his demands were not being met. Then he kind of freaked out a little bit. And he was pretty nervous and jittery a lot, especially toward the end of the hijacking. But I think it kind of vibes with him, to pick something like that. And it's kind of romantic in a way. This was going to be this guy's last hurrah, in a way. There was no guarantee that he was going to live. Not at all. Maybe he felt like he was, but somewhere in there, he had to wonder if something went wrong, if he would live. So he was willing to take a huge gamble with his life and the lives of others because he felt compelled and entitled to, to a monetary thing. And so in that way, coupled with the uninterested kind of like, just Mr. Cool kind of persona he was giving off, I think that they're tied together. I think he wanted people to see him like Dan Cooper, the dashing hero.
Why are there so many suspects in this case?
Oh, just because I think, DB Cooper is cool to people. And, I think, honestly, I think most of the suspects think that he didn't make it. So they don't think that, the people that have claimed to have been him, I don't think they're worried about the real guy ever surfacing. And so, I think that they don't worry about that. I think they're like, well, I am Dan Cooper, because they're not worried about it ever coming to light that that they're not. So, that's part of it. But of course, the bigger part is that, for whatever reason, and there's many that we covered, he's an attractive figure in our collective cultural zeitgeist. And so that makes him appealing in so many different ways. The whole Robin Hood thing, even though he wasn't a Robin Hood, he did try to give some money to the stewardesses, but again, I think that's because he cared about how they saw him, and he wanted to impress them with his knowledge and how in control he was, and how giving he was, even though, of course, he's threatening to kill them the whole time. So there's this juxtaposition in character, but also I think people only ever really possess like a baseline comprehension of what he really did. And so, when they accuse somebody of it, they're almost like accusing somebody of being like like a bank robber that didn't hurt anybody. But, really, as you peel back the layers, these people, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner in particular, carried years of emotional pain from the event. Years. I don't think they're either over it yet in a lot of ways. So he did do harm, but in the collective conscience of the United States, I think he's attractive because people think he didn't hurt anybody. And so if they accuse somebody of a crime like that, it might not be that big of a deal because he's cool and he's dashing and he's kind of this Robin Hood figure, and he's an outlaw too, of course. But so that, and just the manifestation of who he is in our cultural zeitgeist, I think is why.
We touched on confessions a little bit, but did you listen to the episode I did with Larry Carr?
I did, I think. Yes, I did.
One of the things I found most shocking about what he said to me was that while he was working that case for the FBI, 2 different people walked into an FBI office to confess. And, in my opinion, there's a big difference between confessing to being D.B. Cooper to your family or at the bar with your buddies, and then taking it a step farther and going into an FBI office to confess to a crime. And that just, takes it to such another level.
For sure. No, it does.
What do you think compelled those people, if you could speculate on that, to want to prove their confession somehow?
Right. Please allow me. I will definitely indulge the question. Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting point, right? There's this kind of dichotomy between like accusing someone of being Dan Cooper, confessing to being him, and then walking in and confessing like that, right? Because if you confess to a loved one, that's not the same, right? It doesn't carry the inherent legal ramifications that are immediately going to follow. I would just chalk it up to there being a lot of people on the street and in the world that are unwell, and I see it every day. I hate to be one of those people that's, I've seen it a million times, but you see it a lot. And drive through Portland now, there's a lot of people that are not doing very well, and so I think it has something to do with that.
All right, I got 3 questions for you here that are along the same line, so I'll just ask them all at once and you can expound on that. Why is this case unsolved? Will it ever be solved? And what will it take to solve this case?
Oh, those are good questions, and those are like the big $1 million, each one is like the $1 million question. It's unsolved personally, and I was trying to summarize my thoughts on this in anticipation. I think, and this is kind of a version of why it's unsolved, I guess, is the most succinct way of putting it. I think that rather than Cooper being the reason that it's unsolved, of course, Dan Cooper did a lot of things that night that led to the various things, right? Like he was the active agent in the whole event. So to say he had nothing to do with why it's unsolved is inaccurate. But it's my contention that it has less to do with Dan Cooper as a criminal and more to do with this set of circumstances that lined up almost perfectly. And some of those are things that he did deliberately. We have to assume that he chose that day for a deliberate reason, whether it was because he wasn't working. I think personally, Dan Cooper was probably out of work anyway. So he may have known that it would actually be a heavy travel time. So he thought he could blend in more readily. But in any case, the fact that it was Thanksgiving the day before, that's part of it. The fact that the crew was compliant and did everything he asked them to do. The fact that we don't really know where he jumped out, of course, is critical. Again, he didn't know where he jumped out. There's no way he could have known. Not precisely. Cloud cover was at 5,000 feet in some areas. While it was drizzling rain, that was on the ground. Up where they were at in the plane, he couldn't have seen the ground. He may have seen like the lights of Portland somehow and jumped. I think that's reasonable. Maybe the lights of the Lake Merwin Dam. I doubt it. In any case, the fact that even he didn't, I don't think, know where he jumped out. So now you have the police the day before Thanksgiving. It's nighttime. He jumps out in a very rural area. He probably lands in the water. And if you believe that he died, which I do, now you have a body in the water 25 miles or 20 miles from where the FBI is even looking. Tina Bar is a remote location. There's no residential housing out there. Not really. Some, but not much. It's remote. There wasn't much foot traffic there, even in 1971. There was people that went fishing, but again, this is Thanksgiving. It's cold. It was cold in that area. There wasn't a lot of people out there that winter. Not people that are going to be able to spot a body necessarily. So if he does land in the water, which is my theory, and he dies, he's going to float for a while. He's buoyant, but it's a huge river. And the fact that he didn't get found or spotted, that's not hard to believe. Not at all. People drown all the time, and people see them drown and they never find their body. So that is not that mysterious to me. Again, circumstances. Nobody got a picture of him. I think he was a lonely guy. So nobody reported him missing, which is not unreasonable. There's been a lot of people over the years who went missing that were not reported missing.
And in the early 70s, men often did not get reported missing.
Right. And so I also think that I think he probably had a family. But I do believe that he was estranged from them. And so that lined up perfectly, right? That's a circumstance that aligned. The fact that the crew was compliant and didn't tackle him, or or the FBI didn't shoot off the plane. Again, he did draw the shades and stuff, but the FBI was kind of reckless in those days. So that lined up perfectly. The fact that he got to sit in the back of the plane, that kind of lined up perfectly. So you have, because he got on the plane second to last. Somebody could have already been sitting there. Then what? What is he going to tap him on the shoulder and be like, move? Like, okay, that's another interaction that could lead to a conflict, and he did not want that. So, just kind of by chance, by dumb luck, he got the back of the plane. Of course, people are going to fill up, presumably from the front back on an airplane in those days. The front of the plane is first class and things, but there was no guarantee. They let people sit wherever they want, I believe, on that particular flight. So why is it unsolved? Because I think the circumstances lined up perfectly, and these things do happen, and it's one of those anomalies. I think it can be solved, and I think it probably will be eventually.
But what will it take to solve this case?
Well, for me, and this is just me personally, I think everybody has a different line on where they are with this. It wouldn't take as much as one might think by listening to me on this stuff, because I think a lot of it just cannot be known. But for legally, how could it be proved? Through DNA and things like that, of course. And that's the only way it gets definitively closed. But reasonably solved, a suspect that checks all the boxes, and again, like the actual boxes, which I guess is debatable, but somebody that looks like the sketch, reasonably more fits the physical description, and checks my my boxes. But legally, I don't know 100% if there's, I don't think anybody does, that the cigarette butts and the what is the other thing that they botched? Oh, the hair. The jury's kind of out on that. Different people have different things. 100%, those things are gone. But until I see a destroyed evidence receipt, a hand receipt from the FBI that says, yes, this was lot, whatever alphanumeric code they have, and it's one hair on a glass slide, then I'll believe that evidence is destroyed 100%. But I do think that there is a possibility that evidence could be retrieved someday, or that as DNA technology continues to improve even more, who's to say where we'll be in 50 years? They will find DNA on that tie eventually. That is, reasonably DNA that is degraded to the point that it's from that time period. And there's not going to be, I don't know if they passed it around to 100 different people, but someday I think DNA technology will be accessible enough and good enough, and it'll be reasonable enough, affordability wise, to test to test any DNA sample that's on the tie. And I think it could be solved that way, but I don't really know.
If I have to wait 50 years, I'm going to be very upset.
Well,
very
right.
upset.
I think that's the only way that it gets solved, like by the legal definition of like, yes, it has to be this guy. This is his DNA. It's on the tie. And even that, a good defense attorney could probably argue it, right? Presuming, of course, that Cooper would be alive at whatever point that would be, which, even if he did survive, he's probably dead by now. Anyway, so, if a good suspect came along that made sense, and and the person peddling, quote unquote, the suspect, did not try to leave out information and be persuasive, for me, I could believe it. Of course, I wouldn't believe it 100%, but I think my powers of deduction and what have you, it would sit okay with me, until definitive proof ever came down the line, if at all. So the long roundabout way of answering all that is unsolved because of the circumstances, how they lined up the way they did. Part of that was Cooper. A lot of that was just what happened that night. I do believe it could be solved, and I think that someday it might be.
Well, if I have a suspect I want to run by you, or if I want to tell you that he definitely survived the jump and you're a total moron, is there somewhere that I can argue with you about all this stuff?
In the YouTube comments section. I'll check back on it periodically. I don't know that I'll listen back to the podcast, but
well,
I will be
I found you on Reddit.
Right. Yeah, we could do that.
Can the audience argue with you on Reddit?
Yeah, of course. I think I don't social media too much. I think my screen name on there is Balfour Digger 91.
Balfour Digger on Reddit. It's the DV Cooper subreddit. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading what you have to say. I've been trying to get you on the show for months, but you're a very difficult person to get a hold of.
I appreciate it. No, it's very kind of you to reach out, and it's been my pleasure. It's been a big honor. I've listened to several of the different podcasts that you've done, so it was a surprise and an honor, and I'm glad to have sat down for 3 hours to talk about this stuff.
Well, I'm glad you did, Jimmy, and thank you so much for coming on. It's been great, my friend.
Of course. Yeah. Oh, not to the last thing, if I may, right
Oh,
before we leave, I didn't get to hit this. I think that when it is solved, at which point, if it ever does, I think that the person is not going to be, I think they're going to be of mixed ancestry. I think there's enough evidence and enough eyewitness testimony that uses specificity in the way this individual looked for various biases that the different people that have had suspects and things, and the way that, you know, the hegemonic infrastructure in the United States, I think that people have of different, I think that basically people are a little biased to think it was a person that was white, when that in all likelihood is not the case, that the person was at the very least of mixed ancestry. And so I think a good suspect probably will be somebody that is either Latin American, Native American, Mexican American, and Caucasian ancestry as well. But I think that's a good place to start. It's a good baseline. If your person is 100% Caucasian with sandy blonde hair, or they're bald, or they have blue eyes, probably not D.B. Cooper. That's all I'll say on it. Thank you so much, Darren.
Thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate it.
If you'd like an opportunity to chat with Jimmy, you can find him on the DB Cooper subreddit, which is not hard to find, but we have a link to it in the show notes for you. Would you like to present your work on DB Cooper? Do you want the opportunity to clear your relative's name? Did you solve the case? Hit us up. You can find the Cooper Vortex on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or email us, dbcooperpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to Jimmy Calhoun. I am so glad I bullied you into doing this show. Thank you to Russell Colbert, who bullies me into continuing to do this show. Thank you to Darren Osadich for the use of his music. I'm Darren Schaefer, and thank you for listening to the Cooper Vortex.
Here's a story we all know about a man many years ago. Hijacked a plane, so we were told. Then he jumped into the cold. Lights are burning and a cigarette. In the air, the stage is set. Polite and kind, the people say it's time to make his getaway. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. Rolled up in his coat-built tie. He's got enough to change his life. Where he landed, no one knows. But from his tale, a legend grows. Was a cold, dark, rainy night. As he walked, he saw light. Held his cash close to his side. Just needs to catch a ride. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. Down to the bone. Look for a place to use the phone. Little cafe outside of town. He walked in, he just sat down. Met a man with a cowboy hat. Who told a friend right where he's at. Into the night he disappeared. from that night a legend reared. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. 40 years, the secret's out. The story has been told. D.B. Cooper's done running now. He was 80